Our story opens with a quick look at Pharaohs, a kingdom ruled by magic users. On the very night the brutal war over the throne was finally reaching its last stage, one powerful noble made up his mind and chose a plan so direct, so ruthless, that there was no room left for hesitation. The one marked for death was the second prince. One of that noble's subordinates stood by almost impatiently, waiting for the order to fall. In his eyes, there was only one man fit to rule, and anyone standing in the way of that future had no right to keep breathing. At that moment, the second prince had taken shelter inside a rather unusual palace, and because of where he was hiding, the order was given without any further delay. Kill the prince on the spot, and cut down anyone foolish enough to stand in the way. But before the group could even move out, one young man acted first. Without wasting a single word, he suddenly turned on one of his own supposed allies and struck him down where he stood, sending the man to his grave in an instant. After that shocking move, the young assassin calmly offers a polite apology, almost as if nothing unusual just happened, and then says he would like to speak directly with the second prince. That single request is enough to make everyone around him go stiff. The room freezes, and fear spreads through the others before anyone even dares to answer. The loyal guard immediately steps forward, planting himself in the assassin's path, and taking up a defensive stance to stop the intruder from going any farther. Then, the moment he catches sight of the red eyes hidden beneath that hood, he realizes the enemy standing in front of him is someone he actually knows from the past. To him, this is nothing more than a worthless man. Someone he has always looked down on because he was born without magic, certain that victory is already his. The guard lets arrogance take over, and his confidence swells far too quickly. He is just about to boast that a cheap surprise attack would never work on someone like him, when his body suddenly betrays him and he drops unconscious on the spot with his last line of escape gone in an instant. The second prince is swallowed by despair. Standing there with nowhere left to run, and no one left to rely on, the second prince can only sink deeper into hopelessness. It had been a perfect strike, delivered with chilling precision. The blow shattered the man's nasal bone at exactly the right angle and inflicted damage on the brain, leaving the victim alive, but robbed of the ability to cast spells ever again. Even after putting that opponent down, the boy immediately senses that there is still another wizard nearby, still standing, still prepared to fight. That remaining caster is already on the verge of releasing a spell borrowed from thunder spirits, but before the magic can be completed, the boy moves first and drives a brutal kick into him, smashing his jaw so hard that the shape of his face changes on impact. And even after hitting him like that, the attacker coldly remarks that the wizard is free to leave if he wants to. Unable to form a chant anymore, the wounded warrior switches tactics and tries to use a technique that requires no spoken words at all. That choice proves to be a disaster, because one clean blow is all it takes to send him crashing down the staircase below. From where he stands, the second prince can only stare in disbelief, unable to understand how a capable swordsman and even a Class A wizard were both brought down so easily, almost as if they never stood a chance to begin with. The boy answers with complete calm, explaining that nowhere does it say magic is the only thing in this world capable of hurting someone. That line pushes the prince into open panic. Trembling, he pulls out his weapon and blurts out the question on his mind, demanding to know if Heinz Ferrania sent him. The young man, despite clearly being an assassin, states without hesitation that this is not the case. He then says he came here because of a friend, and that answer nearly drives the prince out of his mind. The prince snaps back that such a thing is impossible, insisting that a Galda could never be friends with someone born into the royal family. Cornered and desperate, he asks how much it would cost to spare his life. The moment those words are spoken, the intruder is dragged back through a flood of painful memories, and after that, he decides to finish everything without dragging it out any longer. Not long after that, the second prince's death is officially reported as nothing more than an illness, and even his coffin is kept tightly sealed from view. In the end, the second prince's death is publicly explained away as sickness, while the coffin itself remains shut the entire time. And with that, the dark shadow that had been hanging over the palace at last begins to recede. Some time later, while quietly sitting in his chambers and reading in peace, another noble suddenly startles when that same figure appears before him without warning and calmly calls him by name. Heinz Ferrania. Now that his younger brother is gone, there is hardly any doubt left that he will soon be the one to inherit the throne. The assassin looks at him and asks what it feels like to watch the dream he has chased for so long finally take shape before his eyes. Heinz answers without excitement or arrogance, saying that this moment is not the end goal at all, but only the first step. He goes on to reaffirm the promise he made long ago, declaring that once he becomes king, he will abolish every discriminatory law aimed at those who were born without magic. The assassin has known Heinz for far too many years to doubt the sincerity in those words, because the bond between them is real, and neither of them is pretending otherwise. But before long, another issue rises to the surface. The fact that a Galda is not even allowed to attend the coronation. Heinz Ferrania makes it clear that he will handle the matter himself and personally grant permission, and hearing that is enough to light up his companion on the spot. The assassin understands, There is no point in rushing things so hard that it throws the kingdom into chaos. So he accepts the reality that changing a society this broken is going to take time. With that understanding between them, Heinz suggests that his friend leave the capital for a while and return to his hometown to breathe again. The assassin agrees without much resistance, feeling that after everything the war has put him through, he has more than earned a little rest now that the fighting is finally over. Later that same day, he wrings out a cloth with both hands and wipes himself down as thoroughly as he can, scrubbing away the grime clinging to his skin. Lantern in hand, he makes his way through what looks like an abandoned place, moving slowly through the dim interior as the weak light sways with each step. All around him are old arcane books and rows of training dummies, the kind of space that feels like it was once meant for study and relentless practice. Even standing there, he struggles to accept it. A life that had been ruled by nothing but constant battle might truly be over at last. Because he has no magic at all, nobody can sense his presence, and that trait had always been priceless in his line of work. From the very beginning, he understood that the enemies most worth fearing would be powerful wizards. So while swordsmen and martial artists were threats too, he came to a harsh conclusion early on. If raw strength alone would never be enough, then maybe he needed to learn magic for himself. Heinz Farania immediately reminded him that he simply was not born with that gift. But by then, the young man had already made up his mind. He swore he would study magic more obsessively than anyone else, and train his body just as hard. All so he could somehow crush that weakness with effort alone. That was the promise the two of them made to each other before everything truly began. As he looks back over those old study materials, the assassin cannot help but reflect on just how long and how utterly exhausting that war had really been. The next day, while taking what should have been nothing more than an ordinary walk, he hears a vendor call out cheerfully and urge him to come take a look at the newest goods on display. Among the items at the stall are fresh pineapples, something so rare in that region that they stand out immediately. The boy pauses and thinks about buying one as a gift for a companion, already certain that it would be enough to make her smile. The merchant casually names the price, saying it will cost only a single copper coin. But the moment he notices something, those red eyes under the hood, his attitude changes at once and he flatly refuses to sell. In answer, the assassin calmly takes out 2 silver coins and asks him again, in a level voice, whether he truly wants to do business or not. Just as expected, whispers begin spreading through the people nearby, as they murmur to each other about a Galda walking openly among them in broad daylight. And as the boy keeps moving forward, the people ahead of him hurriedly step aside, shrinking away, as though even standing too close might bring some kind of curse down on them. That so-called curse is nothing more than the label forced onto the Galda, the only race in the land born without magic. Years earlier, one king had decreed that the Galda were to be treated like livestock by the Alcair, creating a cruel social order built entirely on whether or not someone possessed magic. From there, things only grew uglier. The Galda were enslaved, thrown into wars as disposable soldiers, and slaughtered in massacres that were not merely overlooked, but eventually encouraged. As time passed, nearly every problem in the kingdom was pinned on the Galda, a convenient lie the monarchy was more than happy to keep feeding to the people. Just thinking about that twisted reality makes the assassin feel physically sick. Even so, there is nothing he can do in that moment except keep hoping for a future where all of it is torn down and changed completely. As he walks along the road, his eyes catch a small girl stumbling while trying desperately to keep up with her friends, and after tripping she bursts into tears right there on the ground. So, like any decent adult would, he stops in place and moves to help her instead of passing by. When the little girl looks up and sees the red eyes beneath his hood, she pauses for a brief moment. What appears on her face is not fear, and it is not disgust either. To his surprise, what he sees there is pure admiration. It is the first time in his life that anyone has ever looked at him that way. Before long, the child wipes herself off and runs off again, leaving the Galda standing there with a strange, unfamiliar warmth rising in his chest. Now more than ever, the thought of being treated as an equal no longer feels impossibly far away, and deep down he knows this is only the start. Much later, after night has fully settled in, the young man finds himself stopping in hesitation after being away from home for 10 long years, wondering what kind of welcome waits for him there, if there is anyone left at all to welcome him in the first place. Old memories begin surfacing on their own, one after another, whether he wants them to or not. He remembers a much earlier day inside their little cabin, when his mother scolded him for playing around with a knife instead of handing it over properly. And even when she told him that he needed to find work, there had never been any harsh pressure in her voice. What he heard back then was never coldness. It had always sounded like worry. More than anything else, his mother had simply wanted her son to find his place in the world and do his honest best with the life in front of him. Because she already understood that the world would never treat him kindly. She had tried to prepare him for that truth from an early age. That was why she had told both him and Lena again and again that no matter what happened or how far they wandered, they would always have a place to come back to. Even now, after 10 full years had passed, he still carried an amulet tied to those memories close to his body. A small, quiet keepsake that held the warmth of home, of family, and of the only real comfort he had ever known. The instant he draws closer, that fragile sense of comfort is ripped apart. Even though it is deep into the night, the entire area is glowing as bright as daytime under the blaze of raging fire, and the heat pressing against him is almost impossible to breathe through. In that single moment, the hopeful future the assassin had been picturing in his mind crumbles completely. Faced with that wall of fire, the first thing that rises inside him is not fear for himself, but a frantic, desperate need to know whether anyone might still be alive in there. For the first time in years, he says his own name out loud. Van Kruger, calling into the burning night, as though speaking it might somehow hold reality together for one more second. What answers him is not relief, but pure horror. He finds one villager lying collapsed on the ground. The body so badly ruined it is barely recognizable. Then he finds another, and then another after that. Some of them were not merely killed either. They had been executed and left hanging from a tree. Their bodies displayed like a warning for anyone who survived to see it. Every single face is one he knows. The sight hits him so hard that his thoughts stop working properly, crushed under the weight of what he is seeing. To Van, none of it makes sense. He cannot understand why mere criminals would ever go this far. But in that moment, logic matters far less than urgency. He has to find his mother. He has to find his sister Lena. Everything he had done up until now had been for the two of them. The greatest dream he carried was to rebuild this country into a place where they could finally live without fear. That dream dies the moment he reaches the place where his home used to stand. There, just like the others, a body hangs limply in the air. As Van steps closer, his heart seems to stop in his chest. He recognizes his mother. She is still alive, but only barely, and she tries to force out words through what little strength she has left. Yet the shock is so overwhelming that Van's body locks up where he stands. His mind refuses to accept what his eyes are showing him. That denial only lasts until another sound cuts through it. His sister's voice suddenly calling out. Lena, grievously wounded, and somehow still breathing, manages to reach him with her voice, before collapsing only moments later. Van rushes straight to her and catches her weight in his arms. But instead of explaining what happened, she begs him to run. With what little breath she has left, she insists that the one responsible is still out there, still searching for him. Van can barely believe it, struggling to accept that the second prince might still have more allies than he expected. And at first he tries to focus on helping her instead of listening. But the blood spreading out beneath them tells him the truth far more clearly than words ever could. It has already pooled too much. With her strength fading fast, Lena confesses in a trembling voice that during the years he was gone, she learned how to cook. Through tears, she tells him that more than anything, she had wanted to see Van eat something she made for him with her own hands. Little by little, the light begins to leave her eyes, and with the last of her fading breath, she asks him not to blame himself for any of this, telling him softly that none of what happened was ever his fault. That final moment is stolen away from him, when a knight suddenly drives a blade deep into his back. Several others immediately cheer at the sight, fully convinced that they have finally taken down the leader of the rebel forces. And yet one of them quickly notices something is wrong. Van does not collapse. His body stays upright, and his eyes are still burning with the will to keep fighting. Before he strikes again, the knight pauses long enough to ask why Van never even tried to dodge that attack. Van answers that there is no one left alive for him to protect anymore. To the knight, that answer sounds pitiful, nothing more than the final words of a broken man. But before he accepts death, Van demands to know who gave the order for this massacre. The knight answers without hesitation and tells him plainly that the command came from the king himself. Van cries out in disbelief, insisting that Heinz Ferrania would never do something like this. And then, almost as if those words had called him forth, the blonde king appears right in front of him, alive, unharmed, and standing there in perfect condition. The sight of him leaves Van shaken to his core. From the way Heinz carried himself, calm, measured, and almost too prepared, it was obvious this was never a sudden reveal. He had been waiting for the perfect moment to show Van who he really was. And to make the betrayal sting even worse, Heinz looks at him with open mockery and asks if Van came all this way just to chase after old memories. When the king finally explains his reasoning, there is not even a trace of remorse in his voice. Instead, he coldly insists that Van himself is the one to blame. He declares that assassins who can slip past magical detection, vanish into any hiding place, and move unseen through even the tightest defenses are too dangerous to be allowed to exist. Worse still, he says, those same killers possess enough raw physical power to bring down figures of true authority, making them a threat not just to individuals, but to the peace itself. So in his eyes, beings like that could one day shake the very foundation of his rule. And for that reason alone, they have to be wiped out completely. The moment Van understands what this really means, a wave of revulsion rises straight through him and shows plainly on his face. What disgusts him most is not just the truth, but the realization that he had been deceived from the very beginning. Heinz calmly says he still intends to keep his promise, and that twisted promise is simple. Once the Galda are exterminated, There will be no one left alive to suffer discrimination. Then just as a knight steps in to deal the finishing blow and brings his weapon down, Van suddenly shoots out one hand and catches the blade barehanded. Now that he knows the truth, everything inside him shifts at once. The fight, his purpose, even the way he sees Heinz, all of it changes in an instant. The pain tearing through his battered body stops mattering, because it is swallowed up by something hotter and far more dangerous. A burning thirst for vengeance. Even injured, drained, and pushed to the edge of collapse, Heinz understands better than anyone else exactly what kind of monster Van can become once that murderous side of him is fully unleashed. The knights react immediately, rushing into place and forming a protective wall around the king before Van can get any closer. And Heinz does not stay behind them either. He steps up himself, bracing for battle, as if he already knows this is the moment everything breaks. But in less than a blink, Van smashes through that first line of defense before the knights can even properly respond. Drawing on the secret shadow technique carried in his bloodline, he unleashes the deadly move known as Final Bloom. In answer, Heinz gathers every last bit of magic he can draw into himself and fires back with Lucius Sagittarius. The collision between the two former friends is so violent that the entire battlefield seems to tremble from the force of it. By the time the night grows deeper, knights are scattered all across the ground, their bodies strewn through the aftermath of the clash. Even in that ruined, broken state, Van keeps forcing himself onward, because he is still fighting for his sister Lena. And just the same, even with death hanging over him, he still refuses to bow his head before the Alcaire. Heinz calls that stubbornness foolish, but even he admits that words were never going to change Van's mind. The only thing that could end this was overwhelming force. When the battle is finally over, Van is still clinging to life, lying there in the aftermath with his thoughts drifting through the darkness. After enduring so much pain, betrayal, and loss, he refuses to accept that this is where his story ends. His revenge is not finished yet. It is still hanging there, incomplete, with too much left unresolved. He needs one more chance, just one final opportunity to secure at least some bearable future for his own people. And somehow, whether by fate or by sheer luck, that desperate plea is answered. His eyes finally close against the cold ground beneath him. But when they open again, he finds himself in a room so familiar that it almost feels unreal. Then Lena's voice comes from the stairs as she heads up toward him, calling out to ask whether her brother has finally decided to wake up. Van jerks upright and shouts, asking if she is safe. But Lena only stares back at him, completely confused by the question. She is clearly unaware that anything is wrong, and Van, still convinced this must be some kind of dream, can only listen as she tells him to hurry up and get dressed. With casual impatience, she reminds him that today is his birthday. A moment later, their mother appears as well, and gently encourages him to get out of bed. But the instant Van looks into the mirror, disbelief crashes over him. There is no denying it now. Somehow, he has gone back 10 years. It is the morning of his 15th birthday, and to celebrate, the family is busy preparing for a picnic. His mother and Lena both say that on a day this beautiful, staying cooped up indoors would be a complete waste. For a brief moment, Van starts to wonder if everything he lived through was nothing more than a terrible nightmare. But that doubt begins to crack almost immediately when a gust of wind suddenly sweeps through the room, sending flower petals drifting and spinning through the air, and the feeling of it is far too real to dismiss as a dream. One of those petals lightly brushes against his skin, and in that instant, Van realizes his body still bears the heavy memory of countless battles. With that realization, the scent of smoke from the city floods back into his mind, along with the echo of Lena's final words. The agony of that chest wound still feels horribly fresh to Van, and the screams from that nightmare never really left his ears. Even standing here now, those memories hit him with enough force to make it feel as if it all just happened. So when Lena notices his expression and asks him what is wrong, Van deliberately dodges the question, swallowing everything he is thinking and forcing the conversation in another direction. Not long after that, their mother calls out to them warmly, saying the picnic is nearly ready and that everything has been set out. Van comments on how good the food smells, and Lena, bright and cheerful, immediately answers by wishing him a happy birthday with a smile. At that very same moment, far from that peaceful scene, a unit of knights is already riding hard in pursuit of heretics. There are only a handful of truly capable mages among their number, and with their forces stretched so thin, even the soldiers can tell the odds are bad enough that failure is a very real possibility. The place they are heading for is the autonomous district of the Galda. One of the knights remarks with open indifference that, since their targets are not ordinary civilians, it hardly matters if a few of them end up dead along the way. And although Anisi, the Amazon warrior traveling with them, says nothing out loud, she silently agrees with that cruel judgment. Back at the picnic, Van praises the food, but as he tastes it, he cannot ignore the strange wave of nostalgia hidden in the flavor. That feeling unsettles him even more when he remembers that his mother had made something similar just the day before, with Lena helping her. Because the taste is so familiar, He even notices the tiny flaws in the dish, the kind only someone who already knew it would be able to pick up on. Little by little, the truth starts settling in inside him, and Van begins to accept that he really has returned 10 full years into the past. That means he has been given a chance to change everything, even if he still has no clear idea what the right first step should be. His mother asks him once again whether something is bothering him, and that question makes Van remember that among the Galda, turning 15 was the age when a person had to decide what kind of life to live. There were 3 paths before them. The first was staying in the city and taking on simple ordinary work. The second was leaving the city behind to seek dangerous jobs elsewhere. The third was stepping onto the bloodier road of a mercenary. Even without magic, the Galda were blessed with exceptional physical strength, and because they could not be detected by magic, they were highly valued as escorts in dangerous places. But when war broke out, those same strengths meant they were pushed straight to the very front lines, and most of them never made it back alive. The few who did survive were promised enormous wealth, enough to change their lives completely. Van's mother says that mercenary work was not entirely without value, because money earned that way had undeniably made life better for their family. Even so, she makes it plain from the look on her face and the weight in her voice that she does not want Van choosing that future. In his previous life, though, he had ignored her warning and gone down that road anyway, and that choice was what eventually brought him to Heinz Ferrania. That quiet, reflective moment is broken apart all at once by a sudden loud sound. A bell begins to ring. Van is on his feet instantly, because the meaning of that bell hits him the second he hears it. For one brief, fragile moment he had forgotten. But now the memory comes crashing back all at once. He bolts in emotion and urgently tells his family to leave the city at once, offering no explanation as he runs off. Up ahead, a man is already standing before a crowd, loudly delivering a speech with feverish conviction. He proclaims that the gods themselves have declared dirt to be a sin. Then he goes on to say that the kingdom is still harboring impure beings known as the Galda. According to him, they are born tainted from the moment they come into the world, and darkness lives inside them by nature. These preachers belong to the Purification sect, an extremist religious faction within the Mage Kingdom. Because of those radical beliefs, even the church itself has branded them as heretics. One of their core doctrines insists that the Galda are nothing less than agents of evil, and on Van's 15th birthday, those fanatics fled the capital and took refuge inside the autonomous district. With no proper security in place to stop them, they began carrying out unspeakable atrocities in the name of what they called purification. That day, Van had been forced to hide with his family in a cramped, narrow alley, powerless to do anything but endure it. But this time, he refuses to make that same mistake again. Now that he is inside the city, Van Kruger cuts through the packed streets at full speed, threading his way through the moving crowd, with the kind of precision that barely lets anyone notice him. He slips between pedestrians, uses ledges and stonework to climb where he needs to, and turns the walls and rooftops into his path instead of the road below. Every step is calculated to keep him hidden, never lingering in the open for even a moment as he stays carefully outside everyone's line of sight. Just as the speech is coming to a close, one of the Purification sect zealots steps forward in front of the crowd, clearly ready to carry out the next part of the spectacle. That fanatic raises himself up to purge what he calls a Galda's sins with fire, preparing to burn the victim in the name of cleansing. But before the act can begin, Van is already on the scene, having reached them faster than anyone could have expected. He knows one of the most basic rules for dealing with mages. If you're going to strike, you do it from beyond the edge of their awareness, before they even realize danger is near. So he aims for the most vital points first, targeting the brain and the vocal cords with ruthless accuracy. If the target cannot think clearly and cannot speak, then no spell can be completed, and Van makes sure of exactly that. Still, the instant he drops that fanatic, the situation changes, because his attack is no longer hidden once the body hits the ground. In that one exposed moment, both friend and foe become aware of him at the same time, and all eyes are suddenly drawn to Van. Another zealot panics and reacts on instinct, thrown off by how abruptly the ambush has shattered their control of the scene. Van is even faster than that brief flicker of panic, moving before the man can properly recover. He grabs the enemy's own sword in one smooth motion and drives it straight through him, turning the man's weapon back against him without hesitation. Van understands that ordinary steel will not do here, because only weapons carrying magic can break through mystical protections. That is exactly why taking the opponent's blade was necessary, not optional, if he wanted the strike to mean anything. Then another cultist begins chanting a long-range lightning spell, but Van reacts immediately by hurling the corpse of the fallen fanatic into the path of the attack, letting the body absorb and ruin the spell before it can reach him. Using the opening from below, Van rushes in close and smashes his fist upward with brutal force, sending the target flying away from the impact. At that point, Van judges the battlefield and thinks only 3 enemies are left, when one of them suddenly barks out an order for him to stop. The reason becomes clear at once. The man has a woman in his grasp as a hostage, and he threatens to kill her the second Van refuses. Van had not expected there to be more enemies than the ones he had counted. But even so, he can immediately tell that surrender will not truly improve the situation. The fear on the woman's face is impossible to miss, written plainly in her expression as she trembles in the cultist's hold. Without pausing to think it through, Van drops to his knees on pure instinct and begs the man to stop, choosing the hostage's life over pride. The cultist breaks into a smug grin, clearly enjoying the sight, and yells that Van should have acted obediently like this from the very beginning. A moment later, another fanatic steps in and drives a vicious kick into Van's stomach, the blow knocking the air out of him and slamming him flat onto his back. After that, the remaining purifiers swarm him in a rage and begin beating him without mercy, taking their anger out on him blow after blow. Even though they obviously want to drag the suffering out, the one who seems to be their leader cuts in and orders them to finish Van off quickly. A chill of dread runs through that man, as though some instinct is screaming that leaving this boy alive for even a little longer will end in disaster. When he sees the others hesitating instead of acting, the leader lets go of the hostage himself so he can step in and handle the killing personally. The very instant the woman is no longer in immediate danger, someone else enters the fight and releases a spell of ice. The magic catches the fanatic from behind before he can react, striking him cleanly in the back. Frost races over his body in an instant, spreading across him layer by layer until he is completely frozen in place and unable to move at all. A knight warns him not to struggle, saying that even the slightest movement now could cause his frozen body to crack apart. Speaking in the name of the kingdom's justice, she orders every last fanatic arrested, and the leader's face drains white the moment he hears it. Watching all of this unfold, Van cannot stop himself from wondering why, in his previous life, the reinforcements had come far too late to change anything. Even now, the cultist still tries to issue one last command and tells his followers to kill the hostage. But none of them can respond, standing there stiff and motionless like statues. With that chance secured, the knights close in at once and strip the weapons from each fanatic one by one, ending their resistance completely. That leaves Van looking directly at the woman who stepped in and saved his life when the situation had nearly turned hopeless. It is obvious from her gaze that she saw everything Van did, from beginning to end. Instead of scolding him for interfering, she openly gives him credit for how the whole situation was resolved. In her eyes, the fire mage Van took down by himself was dangerous enough to reduce the entire city to ashes if left unchecked. She admits that she could have beaten that mage on her own, but explains that she had been working out a way to do it without causing unnecessary damage to the city around them. From what she says, Van's sudden intervention was the very thing that forced the kingdom to move immediately instead of waiting any longer. She then asks what kind of reward he wants for what he has done, but Van only thanks her sincerely for coming to his aid. Intrigued by that answer, she asks for his name, and after he introduces himself simply as Van, she responds by introducing herself as Helene Steinhertz. Even after Van turns down any reward, Helene Steinhertz goes a step further and invites him to visit the Magic Academy, a proposal so unexpected that it leaves him completely stunned. The moment he hears the name of the academy, Van asks her at once whether it belongs to the kingdom itself. Helene Steinhertz confirms that it does, then adds that even commoners are allowed to enroll there, so long as they possess enough talent to qualify. Hearing that, Van remembers what he knew from his past life. The Magic Academy was famous for producing countless legendary warriors and powerful mages. Still unable to fully understand why she singled him out, Van asks Helene Steinhertz why she chose him in particular. Instead of answering him out in the open, Helene Steinhertz says they should continue this conversation somewhere more private, away from listening ears. Before Van can even object, she grabs his hand and starts pulling him along almost forcefully, brushing off any resistance and telling him to lead since he knows this part of the city better than she does. After several minutes of moving through the area and even crossing a river, the two of them finally reach a quiet, isolated spot where no one nearby could possibly overhear what they are saying. Once they stop there, Helene Steinhertz glances around and casually remarks that this kind of hidden place would be perfect for carrying out an assassination. Then, without the slightest warning, she summons a bow made of ice and looses a freezing arrow straight at Van. Van reacts instantly, moving with a speed that rivals a magical step. And yet he does it without using any magic at all, a feat so abnormal that it visibly shocks Helene Steinhertz. In the next blink, he disappears from her field of vision entirely and slips around to her blind spot before she can properly track him. Even with that opening, Van does not follow through with an attack because his instincts are already telling him that Helene Steinhertz is testing him rather than truly trying to kill him. Hearing such calm, measured composure from someone as young as him unsettles her even more than his movement did. Van asks her directly if that was supposed to be a test, and Helene Steinhertz answers just as directly that she simply has a habit of confirming things with her own eyes. After hearing that, Van presses further and asks what exactly she plans to do with what she has now learned about him. Helene Steinhertz tells him plainly that he may have the power needed to change the fate of the Galda, but that future can only begin if he enters the Magic Academy. Van immediately asks if she is talking about the Night Conference, and Helene Steinhertz confirms it, saying without hesitation that she believes he has the potential to make it through. The night conference is a system that rewards the most exceptional students of the academy, no matter what family they come from or what class they were born into. Anyone who passes earns the right to found a noble house within the kingdom, and the land they are granted is usually tied to the region they originally came from. If Van were to achieve that, then there would be no doubt at all that the territory given to him would be the autonomous district of the Galda. That possibility hits him hard, leaving him visibly stunned, because he had never once imagined a path like that even existed for him. Unlike in his previous life, he is still young enough this time to qualify for the entrance examination before the age limit shuts him out. Even so, Van does not accept immediately, and instead says that before he gives any answer, he has 3 questions he needs answered first. Helene Steinhertz agrees to hear him out, and Van starts with the first issue on his mind, recalling that admission requires a recommendation from a noble. She tells him at once that she will write that recommendation herself, and encouraged by the fact that he is taking the idea seriously, Helene Steinhertz urges him to continue. Van then points out that attending a magic academy when he cannot use magic sounds completely absurd, and Helene Steinhertz admits that the concern is a fair one. Still, she reminds him that every victor of the night conference shared one thing in common. They all helped rediscover the principles behind magic in one way or another. Research into potions, magic circles, and other related fields has already proven that magic is far wider and more complex than most people have ever believed. So if Van can demonstrate his power to the world, then even defeating mages without using magic could become a valid discipline worthy of study in its own right. In other words, Helene Steinhertz is telling him that success may be difficult, but in her eyes, it is far from impossible. For his final question, Van looks straight at her and asks about her real motive. What he wants to know is simple. What exactly does she gain from helping him rise high enough to become a noble? Helene Steinhertz answers that question with one of her own, asking him whether he truly does not trust her. Van does not back down and says he needs to know what she stands to gain by making him the lord of the Galda. She admits that helping him would bring her some benefit as well, but she refuses to say anything more, and that only keeps Van on guard. At that exact moment, Lena's voice rings out as she runs toward them, calling for her brother and asking what he is doing in a place like this. Breathing hard from the rush, she explains that she heard he had gotten involved in a fight with dangerous people. Van apologizes for making her worry, and Lena immediately throws her arms around him, hugging him tightly, while scolding him for always insisting he will be fine right before doing something reckless. Watching that exchange, Helene Steinhertz quietly remarks that Van does not actually need to trust her. But she also reminds him that if he gains a noble title, he would finally hold the authority needed to protect not only his sister, but his whole family as well. Then she swears that this is no trick, invoking the name and honor of House Steinhertz itself. After Helene Steinhertz leaves, Van stays where he is, still holding Lena in his arms while his thoughts continue to churn. When their mother finds out that he directly confronted the purification sect zealots, the shock of it leaves her deeply shaken. And yet, as townspeople begin showing up one after another to thank him, she recognizes the same heroism in her son that once lived in her late husband, and a smile slowly appears on her face. Later on, the conversation turns to the Magic Academy, and that subject brings a fresh wave of surprise into the room. Van explains everything to them, from the reward he was offered, to the recommendation letter, to the decision he has already reached in his heart. Lena immediately tries to object, pointing out that the academy is supposed to be a place only for mages. Van answers that this is exactly why he wants to go, because he intends to prove that they are not lesser beings just because they lack magic. He turns the matter over carefully in his mind. But no matter how much he thinks about it, he cannot see any other path that would let him save everyone. In his previous life, the only way he ever found meaning was by attaching himself to one of the royal contenders, and moving under that banner. This time, he cannot afford to stumble forward without thinking, nor can he allow an opportunity like the one Helene Steinhertz offered to slip past him. Van has already experienced death once before, and because of that, he knows that if even the faintest shred of hope exists, he has to seize it. His determination to put an end to discrimination against the Galda has not changed in the slightest. The sheer force of that resolve shocks both his mother and Lena, and in his eyes, his mother sees the very same look his father once carried. Even though she admits she still does not know whether she can fully agree with his choice, she also understands that there is no stopping him now. When Van asks whether she can forgive him, his mother looks at him and admits that this stubborn streak of his clearly comes from his bloodline. In the end, she accepts that this is the reality in front of her. That answer draws a heartfelt thank you from Van, but his mother quickly shifts the conversation and asks the practical question he has completely overlooked. How is he planning to cover the academy's registration and tuition fees? Van can only admit, a little awkwardly, that he had not thought that far ahead at all. Lena immediately offers to help too, but instead of comforting him, the thought of placing that burden on both his mother and sister leaves Van sinking into quiet despair. Fortunately, that heavy worry does not stay with him for long. Without anyone even asking her, Helene Steinhertz sends over a reward for the purification sect zealots Van defeated. The money is enough to let him prepare for the trip without constant fear or hesitation, and knowing he will almost certainly face discrimination once he reaches the academy, his mother warns him not to let resentment poison his heart. She tells him to keep his head high no matter what happens, reminding him with quiet pride that he is the son she is proudest of. Van takes those words to heart and accepts them with firm resolve. Before he leaves, Lena promises that when he comes back, she will make him mushroom soup. And Van answers with a small smile that he will be looking forward to that. And so, he finally sets out on his journey, waving goodbye from a distance while carrying a silent determination to keep his promises this time. After a long road and an exhausting trip, Van at last stands before the gates of the place that will shape a major part of his life. It is that season of the year when young men and women from all across the kingdom gather at the academy, each of them chasing a future of their own. Alexis von Hohenberg is the first to step forward. With calm confidence, he presents a recommendation letter signed by his own father. The moment the guard sees it, his attitude changes completely, and he bows with polished respect before the young noble. Not long after that, Elisabeth Kreutzner steps up as well and offers a recommendation letter marked with the signature of a duke. She receives the same refined courtesy, and then, after that smooth exchange, it becomes Van's turn to approach. The moment he steps forward, it is obvious he is not going to pass through this place unnoticed. Whispers spread through the crowd almost instantly, and people start pointing him out, shocked that a Galda would have the audacity to appear here in person. Van stays perfectly calm and says that he is doing nothing illegal, because all he has come to do is apply for the entrance examination. His calm tone does absolutely nothing to ease the irritation twisting across the guard's face. Van then reminds them, without raising his voice, that the Academy's own motto says it accepts people regardless of status. The younger guard immediately flares up, taking Van's words as a direct insult, an open provocation. Van can feel the situation becoming dangerous by the second. If he resorted to force, putting everyone here down would be easy for him, but the result would be complete chaos at the front gate. Before things can spiral that far, the older guard cuts in and tells his partner to calm himself down. At last, someone here speaks with at least a little sense. In a dry, experienced tone, the veteran remarks that every year some foolish Galda gets the same idea and tries to enter the academy. Still keeping his voice restrained and almost courteous, he explains that the academy itself does not discriminate. What it does require, however, is a proper recommendation letter. What he clearly does not expect is for Van to calmly reach in and produce one on the spot. One of the guards takes the letter to inspect it, and the second he notices the noble's seal pressed onto it, his expression changes. He blurts out that it cannot possibly be real and insists that no noble would ever approve something like this. Convinced the document must be forged, he reaches out and tries to snatch the seal for himself. Van catches the man's arm in an instant and slams him down onto the ground before he can do anything else. The entire crowd around them goes dead silent. The older guard can only stare in disbelief, unable to understand how his fellow guard was taken down so quickly without even realizing what had happened. A moment later, another person approaches the scene and sharply demands to know why there is such a disturbance at the gate. The instant they recognize the examining lord, both guards drop to their knees before him. The older guard tries to wave the whole thing off as nothing serious, but by then too many eyes are already fixed on the incident for that excuse to work. With everyone watching, Van introduces himself and explains in an even, controlled voice that he is carrying a recommendation from Helene Steinhertz. Most of the people nearby do not understand what that name really means. The examiner, however, recognizes the letter as genuine the moment he sees it. Forced to swallow his pride, the examining lord apologizes for the behavior of the guards. Even so, the revelation that someone like Van is backed by House Steinhertz sends another wave of unrest through the people around him. At that moment, Van quickly realizes that Helene Steinhertz is far more influential than some insignificant noble he could easily dismiss. And once he finally passes through the academy gates, the atmosphere inside immediately confirms every fear he had been carrying with him. This is a place ruled by the elite, through and through. Even so, among all those faces, Van notices some people he recognizes. Dietrich is one of them, but the man standing here now feels worlds apart from the fearless swordsman Van remembers from before. Not far from him stood Shale, the famed fire mage, his presence alone carrying the kind of pressure that made people instinctively notice him. And when Van looked again, he spotted Lunaris as well, the girl who in the future would be revered as the divine maiden of justice. Just like that, he found himself staring at a gathering packed with people who would one day become living legends. Unlike Van, every one of them was fated to rise as a celebrated hero of the kingdom, praised by the masses for taking the fight straight to the front lines. But once the struggle over succession set the kingdom ablaze, those same heroes would be reduced to nothing more than game pieces, moved around by rotten princes from behind the scenes. And in one form or another, Van had once been the one forced to wipe them out with his own hands. This time, though, things were different. Instead of hiding in the shadows as an assassin, Van would have to stand in the open and face every one of them head-on. He knew it would be anything but easy, but this was still the first real step toward changing the kingdom's future. And almost on cue, the first troublemaker showed up, making it painfully obvious he had come looking to pick a fight. Van calmly asks if that comment was directed at him, but the noble's twisted sneer and arrogant stance already make the answer crystal clear. Van tries to state, plainly and reasonably, that he has every right to walk the grounds of the Magic Academy, yet the noble reacts as though Van's mere existence there is some kind of personal offense. Just like in the past, the man falls back on the same rotten instinct, trying to make himself feel bigger by trampling on Van. For the briefest instant, the old assassin living inside Van thinks about bowing his head and avoiding the confrontation. Then his mother's words come back to him, reminding him to keep his posture and never let himself shrink. At the same time, he remembers Heinz once saying that the way a person carries their own dignity determines how others will treat them. So Van says nothing. That silence only makes the bully snap harder, and before long the noble grabs him by the collar, trying to force him into submission. Van doesn't answer with panic or resistance. He simply looks back with a cold, cutting stare that makes it obvious who crossed the line first. What the provocateur doesn't realize is that he has just started something he cannot control. Naturally, Van turns the whole exchange around and seizes control. Rather than resisting with brute force, he blends with the incoming force, guides the noble's movement, and uses the man's own momentum to overturn the situation. It was the exact same technique Van had already used earlier against the guard. And even after slamming the noble to the ground, Van still extends a hand, offering to help him back up. But the noble's pride won't allow him to accept it. Humiliation gives way to fury, and that anger shoves him clean past the line. In the next moment, he starts to invoke magic. Right before anything can happen, a sharp voice cuts through the air and orders him to stop. That command comes from Prince Heinz Ferrania, who steps in and declares that the Galda are allies of the kingdom and stand within its order. The noble is forced to apologize, and Heinz goes further, saying he has no intention of using his royal blood as a reason to deepen the divisions between people. Here, as examinees and students, everyone is to be treated equally. And that, Heinz makes clear, includes Van too. For a second, Van can hardly even process the fact that Heinz is standing here in front of him. Seeing the ninth prince willingly take the entrance exam just like any ordinary candidate only reinforces that old image of humility Van once believed so completely. And with Heinz openly defending a Galda in public, plenty of the other students begin looking at him like he's practically a saint. Van remembers Heinz speaking about the Magic Academy in conversations long before this moment. And now, here in the present, Heinz brings it up again, remarking that Van looks tense. Trying to close the distance between them, he says he feels that same anxiety too, especially with the entrance exam being notorious for its difficulty. Then Heinz gently insists there's no reason to be afraid and offers out his hand, wearing that warm, perfectly practiced smile. For most people, that kind of kindness would have been enough to lower their guard on the spot. But Van knows better now. He already knows what lies hidden behind that pleasant face. He knows the filth buried under the performance. And for a single breath, Van recognizes exactly what kind of chance has just appeared in front of him. This would be the perfect opening to kill Heinz Ferrania. But acting here would be pure recklessness, and it would ruin everything Van has fought to reach by coming to this place. Heinz keeps his hand stretched out between them, but Van never reaches for it. Instead, Van gives some passing excuse and leaves the prince hanging there until Heinz has no choice but to lower his own hand. The reaction is immediate, and murmurs ripple through the crowd at once. Showing that kind of disrespect to someone who could one day become king instantly sets people off, and the resentment is especially strong among those who already disliked Van, including the noble he had humiliated only moments before. Before that tension can boil over into another incident, the examiner steps forward and announces that registration for this year's exam is officially closed. After that, he tells the candidates that he will now lead them to the entrance of the area known as the Shaded Forest. The moment those words leave his mouth, the color drains from plenty of faces. Once everyone reaches the exam site and the applicants are assembled together, a coordinator welcomes them and explains that the Shaded Forest will serve as the testing ground for this year's entrance exam. As everyone there already understands, the Magic Academy exists to polish the elite and shape the people who will one day rule the kingdom. It has never been an institution meant to educate common rabble. Anyone who wants to remain here must first prove that they possess at least the minimum level of strength required to belong, and the Shaded Forest is infamous for one reason above all else. It holds an overwhelming concentration of magic power. Task given to each candidate is simple in wording, but not in practice. They have to enter that magic-soaked area and bring back a flower that has absorbed that very energy. That flower is known as the Tears of Heaven, and there is only one place where it can bloom at all. The real problem is that the plants are not the only things saturated with magic. Every creature living in that region has been affected too, and while Van knew a practical trial was coming, even he had not expected the exam to throw magical beasts at them this early. There is one strict rule laid down before the candidates move out. They are not allowed to directly interfere with one another, but working together is still completely allowed. Even with that option though, Each team has to secure enough flowers to guarantee that every member can pass. The candidates are then divided into two large groups, and the pressure rises immediately when the final condition is announced. They have only until sunset to finish, and on top of that, each student is issued a badge by the guardian. That badge is their emergency lifeline. If they are pushed to the point where death is a real possibility, they can use it to call for rescue. But the moment they do, they are disqualified on the spot. With the rules settled, the exam officially begins. Almost at once, the students start gathering into clusters, carefully picking allies whose talents might cover their own weaknesses. Van, however, is left standing on his own, and honestly, that suits him just fine. In his mind, moving alone means fewer restraints, fewer complications, and far more freedom to act when things turn dangerous. Then his turn comes to receive his badge, and the examiner pauses for a split second. The hesitation is obvious. The man looks openly uncomfortable, like he can barely stand the thought of placing it in Van's hand. Even so, the badge is eventually handed over. Van takes it without a word and walks on, all while feeling that same noble, sharp, watchful stare following him yet again. The moment he steps into the forest, the danger starts for real. A magical beast lunges out without warning, so suddenly that he is given no chance at all to calmly prepare himself. Van recognizes it immediately. At a glance, he can tell it is a medium-class demonic beast. Any creature infused with magic is generally classified as a demonic beast. That means monstrous physical power, strength beyond what normal humans can handle, and in many cases the ability to use magic too, which makes them more dangerous than plenty of ordinary spellcasters. And in that instant, a thought crosses Van's mind. Ever since he became an assassin, up until now, every opponent he had faced had been human. This is the first time in a long while that he is fighting something entirely different. Even with that realization, he never freezes. He steps in without hesitation and slams a straight punch directly into the creature's abdomen. This is not some reckless swing either. Long ago, Van had already mastered techniques specifically meant for bringing down monsters exactly like this. The strike is savage on its own. But what makes it truly deadly is the force behind it. The full momentum packed into the blow. That impact does not stop at the surface. The shock travels inward, ripping through the beast from the outside all the way into its deeper organs, against a clever human opponent. A move like that is much harder to land cleanly, but against a beast that charges on pure instinct, it is devastatingly effective. Back in his mercenary days, Van had run into magical beasts more than once, and because of those encounters, he had made sure to prepare himself. With that in mind, he briefly thinks to himself just how unfortunate the two boys hiding farther away really are. Still, he does not spend much time worrying about them. From the look of it, the noble and the boy with him have not even realized that a fight is already taking place nearby. The aristocrat simply assumes Van must have used poison somehow, while the other only remembers that interfering with the exam is strictly forbidden. In truth, it would not matter much either way. The examiners have no intention of letting Agulda pass, especially not one who had the nerve to openly disrespect a prince. As far as they are concerned, even if Van were to die out here, no one would ever be blamed for it. Elsewhere away from the candidates, one examiner follows the older guard toward a hidden gate tucked out of sight and coldly orders him to fetch the key. The knight tries to protest, trying reason after reason to stop him, but none of it works. The examiner refuses to be talked down. He has already made up his mind. From behind that sealed gate, he plans to unleash the trump card hidden there, and use it to hunt down the boy who dared to join this exam. By academy rules, a candidate who entered through recommendation cannot simply be removed by force. In the examiner's eyes, letting Van pass would disgrace the academy's name, so there is only one acceptable solution left to him: make it look like an accident. The knight keeps warning him, listing all the ways this could go horribly wrong, but the examiner refuses to listen and presses ahead anyway. After all, Van is moving through the forest alone, and no one important has gone anywhere near him. Once the key is brought over, the seal is broken. Then the examiner gives the order to release the cursed beast, commanding it to kill the Galda boy for the sake of the Magic Academy's pride. For reasons even he cannot fully explain, the second examiner is suddenly overcome with a dark, uneasy feeling. Deep down, he senses that this year's exam is heading towards serious disaster. So when he spots his colleague returning, he immediately stops him and demands to know where he has been. The answer comes back far too lightly. The examiner casually says he merely made preparations for what is coming next, and that vague reply only makes the other man even more alert. Back in the forest, Van keeps moving deeper between the trees, and at last he finds exactly what he came for. There, gathered together before him, is a cluster of flowers that matches the description perfectly. It is the first time Van has ever seen the tears of heaven with his own eyes, and if he gathers them now and makes it back safely, then his acceptance is all but secured. That is the moment his pursuers finally decide to stop hiding and show themselves. One of the nobles sneers and comments that Galda really do have sharp senses, comparing them to dogs with obvious contempt. Van fires back that he knows that from experience. Van answers without even flinching. In his eyes, this is nothing new. Cowards always wait until they can strike from behind, and the aristocrat's whole posture makes it obvious he came here determined to shake Van's composure and break him that way. But Van already sees through it. Deep down, he knows the only reason they followed him out here is because they were embarrassed in front of the other candidates and cannot stand leaving things like that. So he says it plainly, almost coldly, that this is exactly the kind of petty behavior he would expect from spoiled, prideful children. And while saying it, he calmly settles into a ready stance without the slightest sign of panic. That single response makes the noble snap on the spot, his face twisting with pure rage. Not wanting to waste another second on words, the two of them immediately begin gathering mana and preparing their magic. The pair is built around two different roles, a magical swordsman in front and a conjuring mage supporting from behind. In this world, magic combat is generally split into three main categories, and the first group is the most familiar one of all. The ordinary spellcasters known simply as mages. The second group consists of magical swordsmen, fighters who pour mana into their weapons and turn each strike into something far deadlier than steel alone. And the third are magical martial artists, warriors who channel mana through their own bodies to sharpen their strength, speed, and physical movement. A team that mixes different styles like that is usually dangerous, because each fighter can cover the other's weaknesses. Even so, it takes Van only a moment to realize that neither of these two has ever truly killed before. They are reckless enough to try and violent enough to threaten him, but the one thing they still do not have is the resolve to actually carry death through to the end. Even with that, Van cannot simply kill them under the excuse of self-defense. The moment a noble dies, their house does not let it rest. Retaliation is inevitable, and it would come down on him without mercy. The aristocracy of this era still carries the brutal temperament left behind by the age of war, and their bloodlines have not forgotten how quickly violence becomes vengeance. This time, Van wants to live differently. He makes up his mind to put aside the assassination methods of his past and defeat them without crossing that line. The noble locks onto Van's completely unshaken gaze, grows even more irritated by it, and then rushes in with a technique he calls wind blade dance. Van slips around most of the attack, but not all of it. One of the strikes still grazes him and leaves a shallow cut across his body. The attacker's expression tightens immediately. He is clearly annoyed that the blow failed to finish Van off in one shot. With his pride stung, he starts bragging on the spot, loudly declaring that the Voltric family is famous for its mastery over wind magic. Then, in a thoroughly arrogant tone, he claims he might spare Van's life if Van gets on his knees and begs. Van's answer comes back as pure mockery. He dryly asks whether the Voltric family's greatest specialty is just using wind magic to cool people off during the summer. That insult lands perfectly. The noble flies into a full-blown fury and throws away whatever restraint he still had left. Mana erupts around him, and he calls forth a violent storm so fierce it looks as if the very sky above them is being torn apart. Van is forced back under that pressure, giving up any thought of counterattacking for the moment and focusing entirely on dodging and staying alive. What shocks the noble is that Van keeps avoiding it anyway. Every time the man's bloodlust surges, Van can clearly read the flow of magic and move before the attack fully lands. And the instant the storm loses force and begins to die down, Van steps back in and launches a crushing counterattack with overwhelming power. The moment one fighter goes down, the magical swordsman visibly panics. In desperation, he lifts his enchanted blade overhead and lunges straight at Van. But the instant Van sees the weapon, he understands what kind of enchantment it carries. It is only a basic one. That means, unless the blade lands a clean direct hit, it is not nearly as threatening as the attacker wants it to be. Under normal circumstances, a sword swing is naturally far faster than a bare-handed strike, usually 2 or even 3 times quicker. Even so, Van's footwork is so precise that he steps around the danger as if the blade barely matters. He ignores the weapon itself, strikes directly at the wrist to throw the attack off course, and instantly exploits the opening that creates. Without giving the swordsman room to recover, Van follows with a short, sharp blow to the arm, and the impact sends the young noble crashing hard to the ground. Even after all that, Van still does not finish them. Looking at the two through their frustration and pain, he asks whether they truly intend to keep going, and his tone makes one thing painfully clear. If they insist on continuing from here, then he will no longer promise that they will come out of it safely. That warning finally breaks the noble's nerve. Shaken to the core, he backs away, forces down his pride, and actually apologizes. And then Van feels it. A strange presence brushes against his senses, so unnatural that his instincts react before his thoughts do. He immediately stops paying attention to the aristocrats, understands that something far worse is coming, and shouts at them to run right now. But before any of them can even process the warning, the beast that was released comes charging in like a nightmare. Its horns tear into them in an instant, goring through the group, and flinging all 3 bodies violently through the air. Agony explodes through every part of them the moment they hit. Van's whole body goes rigid in alarm as soon as he gets a clear look at the creature and recognizes what it is. Standing before them is a hellsboar, a fang-type demonic beast, the kind of monster that turns a bad situation into a massacre in seconds. The nobles stare in disbelief, unable to understand how a monster of this level could possibly appear in a place like this during the exam. But there is no time to stop and question it. The beast is already lowering itself for another charge. Monsters like this are also known as cursed fangs, and once they lock onto prey, they do not stop. Wrapped in magical power on the level of a sage, the creature gives off an overwhelming aura of death. Realizing exactly how hopeless this is, Van warns them that if they can still move at all, now is the time to run. One of them answers at once that running is impossible. He lifts his leg just enough to show the damage, and the sight says everything. The limb is twisted and mangled from the impact, and he says through the pain that it is probably fractured. At best, the injured noble can do little more than force himself upright. Even standing is a struggle now, and one wrong move is enough to make it obvious. He is barely holding on. That leaves Van in a brutal spot. In the span of a few heartbeats, almost every realistic option in front of him starts disappearing. If he tries to carry either of them, his speed drops immediately, and against a monster like this, slowing down even a little would be the same as choosing death. And using the rescue badge is not a real solution either. Even breaking it and waiting for help would take too long to save them. Then one of the nobles grits his teeth and tells Van to run by himself. In his eyes, Van is the strongest mage among them, so if anyone has a chance to survive alone, it is him. The other boy refuses immediately. He declares that being left behind like that would stain their family name, and he cannot accept an ending so disgraceful. Van quickly throws out another plan. One of them should activate the badge, while the other stays behind just long enough to buy time. Ralph Eisenbach rejects that idea on the spot, saying that even death would be less shameful than surviving through something like that. So the two nobles make their choice. For the sake of their family honor, they decide they would rather stand and fight to the bitter end, keeping their heads high even if it kills them. To Van, that is the worst possible answer they could have given. Now, it is not just the monster he has to deal with. He also has to fight against their stubborn pride. His patience finally snaps. Van shouts at them that if they are really going to fight, then they should fight to win, not throw their lives away in some useless, self-satisfied death. The noble bristles at that, taking Van's words as pure arrogance. But with no better option left and no time to argue, they are forced to accept the truth. Cooperation is the only path still open to them. Back at the forest entrance, the second examiner quietly remarks that the timing should be just about right now. The first examiner turns to him and asks what exactly he means, but the question is brushed aside without an answer. Instead, the second man asks a different question, whether any of the rescue badges have been activated yet. When he hears that not a single badge has been broken, the result lands differently for each of them. To the first examiner, it feels strange. To the second, it is disturbingly satisfying. In his mind, that can only mean one thing. Van has not even had the chance to call for rescue. Before the exam started, all of the candidates' belongings were confiscated. The examiner had secretly used one of Van's personal items then, imprinting the boy's scent onto the beast in advance. Now he is convinced Van has already been torn apart and reduced to nothing. Certain that his plan has worked, he stands there waiting with smug confidence, unable to hold back his laughter. Back in the forest, as the monster pushes forward again, all three boys tense themselves and brace for the next clash. Van shouts over the pressure that he will hold the creature in place, and the two nobles are to pour everything they have into attacking it while he does. Falk Waltraich immediately resists the idea of taking orders from Van, but the monster is already bearing down on them too quickly for that argument to matter. The instant Van feels just how close death is, he throws himself forward at the very last second to intercept it. This time, he does not hold back. He draws on assassination techniques, reproducing the same crushing strike as before while using the monster's own speed against it to magnify the damage. But unlike the smaller beast from earlier, this one does not go down from a single exchange. The blow lands, and the damage is real, yet it is nowhere near decisive. The principle behind the technique is simple in theory and deadly in practice. Van predicts the target's movement and strikes directly at the point where that motion begins. With a four-legged beast, the pattern is even clearer. Whenever it attacks, the head is always the first part of the body to move. Van sends the force inward through multiple layers of penetration, trying to break through piece by piece. But a flash of panic hits him when he realizes the impact is not reaching the inner organs the way it should. The reason is painfully clear. This younger body of his, rewound 10 years into the past, has less muscle, less height, and far less raw power than the body he once relied on. For the moment, that is all he can squeeze out. So Van shouts for the next move, and Falk Waltraich responds by casting the Skyripper spell. Blades of compressed wind come slamming down into the Hellsboar one after another. Right after that, Ralph Eisenbach rushes in with his enchanted sword, but the instant the blade connects, it becomes clear that the monster's hide is far tougher than they feared. And then the situation gets even worse. The beast slips into a berserk state. Van instantly yells for everyone to fall back. But the creature does not give them that chance because it is already charging again. It drives itself all the way up to full speed, kicking up violent currents of wind around its body as it barrels straight at them. When Van glances back, his stomach tightens. Both of his allies are down on the ground, unable to move, though at least they are still alive. Falk Waltraich had barely managed to deflect part of the impact with magic, which is likely the only reason he survived at all. But if the beast charges one more time, that will be the end of him. Ralph Eisenbach has already started to believe this is where everything ends. His sword accomplished nothing, and yet Van is still standing there. Then Van declares that he is going to try one more time. To the noble's disbelief, he goes even further and says that on the next attempt, all three of them are going to bring the monster down together. Falk Waltraich stares at him and questions whether Van still has not understood what is happening here, because their magic has already proven ineffective. Van answers immediately with a concrete adjustment. He tells Falk Waltraich to mix stones into the spell and use them to increase the attack's destructive force. Then he turns to Ralph Eisenbach and tells him to stop thinking about brute force and focus instead on driving the blade into the beast's weakest points. Falk Waltraich can barely believe what he is hearing, and he asks Van what on earth he thinks he is doing. From his point of view, the truth is obvious. They have no chance of winning this fight. Van, at least, could still run if he wanted to. And even Falk Waltraich admits, with bitter honesty, that after everything they tried to do to him earlier, he would not even blame Van for abandoning them now. Van answers without wavering, making it clear that revenge was never the reason he came here in the first place. He says his one true wish is far simpler and far heavier than that. He wants his people to be acknowledged as part of this kingdom at last. And because that is the future he is fighting for, there is no way he could ever abandon comrades from the very same nation he hopes will finally be accepted. Those words slam into Falk Waltraich like a direct hit, leaving him momentarily frozen where he stands. In that instant, reality comes crashing down on him, and with it comes a suffocating wave of guilt over everything he has done. But before anyone can sit in that feeling for long, the Hellsboar lowers itself and readies one last savage charge. Van catches the movement immediately, his eyes sharpening as he yells for them to carry out the plan right now. The moment Van gives the signal, Falk Waltraich throws himself into action and unleashes his Windblade dance once again. This time, following Van's advice, he mixes stones into the spell, transforming it into a new version he names Black Dust's Skycutter. A dark blade packed with grit and shattered earth comes crashing down with brutal force onto the fanged beast below. The strike clouds the monster's vision in an instant, and Van seizes that opening at once, declaring that now it is his turn, as he lunges forward. As he moves, Van keeps one crucial fact in mind. The shoulders of four-legged beasts do not work the same way human shoulders do. They are not fixed directly to the spine, which gives the front legs greater flexibility, but in exchange leaves their balance far less stable. Using that exact knowledge, Van activates his rotation technique and strikes in a way that throws the monster's entire body off balance. As the beast starts to topple, he shouts to the others that its heart is at the front, nestled low between the forelegs at the base. This time, Ralph Eisenbach does not hesitate the way he did before. He springs forward at once, but the moment he meets the beast's savage glare head-on, his inexperience still makes him falter for just a split second. Even so, he forces himself through that fear, follows Van's instruction, and drives his sword down where he was told. Falk Waltraich immediately shouts in triumph, already convinced that the battle is finally over. Van, however, feels no such relief, and the look on his face hardens because he instantly knows something is off. The blade did not reach the heart after all, and Van realizes that tiny moment of hesitation may have been enough to ruin the strike. Right after that, the Hellsboar begins to rise again. As a final act of resistance, the monster opens its jaws and unleashes a devastating roar. It is a rare skill for a predator, a magical attack that turns sound itself into a weapon and sends destructive power through its cry. A massive shockwave explodes outward and hurls everything around it through the air, while Ralph Eisenbach is smashed back to the ground, blood pouring freely from him. The instant he lands, a stabbing pain tears through him, telling him at once that the blast has damaged his internal organs. As if that were still not enough, the beast lumbers in close, looming over him at a distance where it could rip him apart where he lies. At that range and moving that fast, surviving it looks all but impossible. Just before the noble can be finished off, Van steps straight in front of him, and among the harmony techniques, the one he chooses now is called Spiral. Rather than meeting force with greater force, the technique works by catching the enemy's power, twisting it into rotation, and driving that momentum down into the ground. Even then, Van knows the truth the moment he faces it. This beast is far too powerful, and there is no chance he can redirect all of that force cleanly. That leaves him with only one final option, and even if it tears his body apart, he decides it is still better than dying here and now. With desperation in his voice, Van shouts at his companions to run and keep running as fast as they can. Ralph Eisenbach gathers the last scraps of strength left in him and somehow manages to drag himself back onto his feet. At the same time, Van rushes in and clamps both hands onto the creature's horns. He strains with everything he has to hold it back. Exhaustion already etched all over his face, yet unlike Van, the monster only seems to grow stronger by the second. Then, with one violent surge, it tears free and flings him away, smashing him into a tree hard enough to rattle him to the bone. Falk Waltrach instinctively tries to move toward him, but Van immediately shouts for him to stay back. The beast, relentless as ever, charges once more. Despite what he has just been told, Falk Waltrach surges forward anyway, unable to stop himself. He is trying no matter what it costs to save Van, but even battered and injured, Van has already made up his mind that he is not going to die here. Under his breath, almost like a quiet prayer or a forbidden key, he murmurs that his heart should sink and the chains binding him should be released. Something dreadful is clearly about to happen, yet before it can fully unfold, an ice spell suddenly crashes into the monster's front paw. The impact makes the beast howl in pain and collapse on the spot, stopping its charge just short of reaching Van. And what leaves everyone the most stunned is not just the spell itself, but who actually cast it. It came from Prince Heinz Faranya in person, something none of the three had expected to see. Nobles immediately cry out in alarm, warning that it is far too dangerous for royalty to remain anywhere near the battlefield. But Heinz Faranya answers without hesitation that protecting the citizens of the kingdom is the duty of royalty, and that declaration visibly shakes both nobles. To Van, the sight of that moment feels painfully familiar, like a scene he has already lived through once before. To Van, this scene is painfully familiar, because this is exactly how Heinz Faranya always won people over before marching them straight toward death. And now, shining in front of them like some bright but false light of hope, Heinz proposes that the four of them join forces and form an alliance. Van does not even pause to consider it. He instantly shouts back that he refuses. Confusion flashes across the nobles' faces at once, mixed with clear irritation, and even Heinz cannot hide the surprise that crosses his expression. Even under all those stares, Van stands firm and repeats himself without softening a single word. He has no intention of working together. He says it plainly, almost coldly, that the power of a royal heir is not something he needs. Falk Waltrach immediately demands that Van show some respect, while Ralph Eisenbach points out that Heinz just saved all of their lives. Van fires back just as sharply, saying that if the prince had not stepped in, he would have settled everything on his own. Heinz looks straight at him and asks whether Van truly means that he does not need anyone's help. Van answers that he does need help, but as he starts walking toward the monster, he tells Heinz to stay quiet and watch from the sidelines, the way royalty usually does. Right after that, Van warns them that the beast is moving again, and only moments later it comes charging straight toward their group. This time, Ralph Eisenbach steels himself and insists that, at the very least, he is going to land one solid hit. Van tells him to stay calm, saying that if they run now, they will only be throwing their lives away. Falk Waltrach adds that he has enough mana left for only one more attack, and Van immediately tells both of them, along with Heinz, to keep their eyes on his signals and move only when he says so. There is something different about Van now, something steady and unshaken in the way he carries himself, and that resolve quietly spreads to the others around him. As he steps forward to intercept the monster, Van remembers how overwhelming his fear had been, just moments earlier. And because he has already faced that fear head-on, he now believes he can win this fight without using the forbidden technique at all. Up to this point, 3 of Van's harmony techniques have already failed against the monster. The beast has also started recognizing them as real threats now, and because of that, it becomes visibly more cautious in the way it moves. Van slips past a wide, sweeping strike, springs upward in one motion, and catches a tiny opening in the middle of the exchange. The creature roars and immediately gives chase, but Van keeps avoiding it at the last possible instant, even using the enemy's own body as a foothold and source of leverage. Falk Waltrach can hardly believe what he is seeing, and neither can Heinz, because speed like this should not even be possible without magic. By shifting the weight of his body and changing his center of gravity without even pushing off the ground first, Van completely removes the usual preparatory motion that normally comes before movement. It is the kind of technique known only to martial artists who have reached the very highest level. So to the two watching from the side, seeing Van kick off, leap, and slip away from a demonic beast without using magic feels completely impossible to understand. Then, in one final maneuver, Van steps directly onto the monster's head itself. That sight alone leaves the two nobles staring in utter disbelief. Heinz, however, understands one thing very clearly. Against a creature of this level, blows without magic are little more than harmless caresses. So as the beast keeps fighting, he starts to believe the whole situation is about to slip beyond anyone's control. Van, on the other hand, declares that this is exactly the outcome he was aiming for. His real objective was never to damage it directly, but to provoke it. And soon enough, the warning signs of a destructive roar begin to show. The instant Van sees that opening appear, He shouts for Falk Waltraich to use his wind magic. Falk reacts without delay, driving stones into the spell and blasting them straight into the creature's open mouth. The debris clogs its airway on the spot, and the beast chokes and collapses under the sudden disruption. Van wastes no time at all. He leaps onto it immediately, comes face to face with the monster at point-blank range, and sets up his crushing double strike technique. Twin. Both blows crash down at the exact same moment onto the center of the demonic beast's skull. The shockwaves from the left and right sides race inward and meet at a single point, like ripples on water slamming into each other. That impact leaves the creature completely incapacitated. With the first part finished, Van gives the signal to Ralph Eisenbach, and Ralph spins his sword once before bringing it down and cleaving the beast apart. The nobles can do nothing but stand there frozen, unable to process the fact that they have actually brought down a monster of such a high level. Ralph Eisenbach, still trying to catch up with what just happened, asks Van what he is doing. Van gives no verbal answer at all. He only stares at Heinz in silence for a moment, then turns away and reaches down to offer Ralph a hand so he can stand. Ralph admits with a pained expression that the inside of his body feels sore, like his organs may have been injured. Van explains that sound-based magic can be partly countered by covering the ears, and Ralph answers that it is a lesson he will never forget again. With the immediate danger finally gone, everyone's attention shifts back to the real objective they came here for. And to Van's surprise, out of the many flowers that had been here before, only 2 are left. This is exactly the price of moving in large groups, just as they had been warned at the very beginning. Van starts thinking fast, fully aware that they are running out of time. But before he can even speak, the nobles move first, gather the last 2 flowers, and begin deciding how they should be divided. Naturally, the first flower is given to Heinz, simply because he is a prince. Van can't hide his disbelief, and questions why a flower should be handed to someone who did nothing but stand there and watch. But Waltraich doesn't even bother responding, acting as if Van's complaint never reached him at all. Without arguing back, the second flower is placed straight into Van's hands instead. Caught off guard by the gesture, Van looks down at it and asks if the boy is really sure about giving it to him. The boy answers in a calm, matter-of-fact way, saying he has no intention of leaving a debt unpaid to anyone. Then, as if settling the matter completely, he gives his name and introduces himself as Falk. Right after that, Eisenbach steps forward as well, and follows the introduction with one of his own, saying that his name is Ralph. The protagonist is visibly surprised by how straightforward both of them are. After a brief pause, he introduces himself simply as Van, and the 3 exchange a few short greetings, all of them carrying the quiet understanding that this may be the first and last time they ever speak. Just as that awkward little exchange seems to settle, Heinz suddenly steps in and cuts through the moment. He bends down and calmly gathers several flowers that had already fallen to the ground, their petals shriveled and lifeless. Then, using light magic, he restores them in an instant, breathing vitality back into the wilted blossoms. The sight is so unexpected and refined that everyone standing there is left stunned. Holding out the revived flowers, he asks them to accept the gesture. He even reassures them in an even tone, making it clear that no harm will come from taking them. Van's eyes shift toward the sky, and he notices the sun already sinking lower toward the horizon. Realizing how little time they have left, he warns everyone that they need to get out of the forest immediately. The way he says it comes out less like a suggestion and more like a direct command. That tone immediately rubs Falk the wrong way, and a faint trace of irritation shows on his face. Before anyone can actually move out, the prince calls Van back and directs everyone's attention to him again. Heinz remarks that earlier, Van had deliberately covered his own footprints with dirt. He goes on to say that he has heard of a movement technique specifically used to conceal one's tracks, a method commonly linked to assassins. Taking that together with the martial skill Van showed earlier, Heinz stops circling around the matter and asks him outright whether he is or ever has been an assassin. Heinz is not asking that question lightly. He is a prince surrounded by enemies on all sides. After the king expanded the kingdom through a series of conquests, he tightened the nation's laws and strengthened his control while also taking foreign princesses as wives. Heinz's mother, however, was different. She had already been a noble before entering the royal family, becoming the 5th queen and the first woman from the kingdom of Foranus to do so. Because of that unusual position, Heinz's brothers and their mothers had every reason to fear the possibility of his rise to the throne. That meant an assassination attempt could come from anywhere, from anyone, and at any time. So Heinz learned to stay on guard constantly, never allowing himself the luxury of carelessness. If Van truly were an infiltrator who had slipped close to him, then Heinz had already decided he would kill the boy where he stood. Van doesn't expect something as small as an old habit to expose him this badly. And the worst part is that, by the strictest definition, he really is someone trained as an assassin. But admitting that here would be the same as signing his own death warrant. So instead he chooses the only option left to him and plays dumb. The prince notices the evasion immediately. In response, Van subtly shifts his stance and makes his intentions clear through his posture alone. If Heinz wants to resolve this by force, then he is ready to stand his ground. The atmosphere turns heavy in an instant, and the pressure between them becomes so sharp that it feels like a fight could break out at any second. The moment Van steps forward, Falk reacts on instinct and moves to stand in front of him. Heinz keeps a stern face, his expression unreadable, but in the very next instant, Van is suddenly at the prince's side, saying it was only a joke. Falk is left completely unable to understand what just happened or how Van crossed that distance so absurdly fast. Sensing the danger of the moment, Van tries to use that opening to smooth things over, slipping back into polite, restrained behavior in an attempt to calm the tension. But Heinz pays that effort no attention at all, because his focus has already landed on something much more important. Van had the perfect chance to capitalize on the opening he created, yet he deliberately chose not to exploit it. At that point, the truth of the situation becomes obvious. This whole exchange was nothing but a test. Still unsatisfied, the prince presses him again and demands a proper answer. He repeats the question, brings up Van's earlier behavior one more time, and asks directly whether the boy is an assassin. Van answers that those techniques came from Helene Steinhertz, and that she is the one who taught him not only that method, but every other hand-to-hand combat skill he knows. Inside, Van quietly apologizes for using her name as a shield. But the moment Heinz hears that the recommendation came from House Steinhertz, his entire expression changes on the spot. Ralph immediately starts explaining, making it clear that this duchy is no ordinary noble house. Van had already guessed that Helene was someone important, but he never knew the full details. Heinz then fills in the gap, explaining that she was known by the title of the Lady of the Ice Flower. She was said to stand above even the Magic Academy's top students, so someone personally trained by her being exceptional would only be natural. On top of that, House Steinhertz was the oldest family still in service to the kingdom. With a house like that behind him, the idea that they would send out an assassin for something like this sounds completely ridiculous. Even so, Heinz asks how Van managed to obtain that recommendation in the first place, but Van has nothing more he can really say. From the prince's point of view, the most reasonable explanation is that the letter was given to nurture Van as a future retainer for the house. After seeing what Van can do with his own eyes, Heinz remarks that if he had reached him sooner, he would have tried to recruit the boy himself. As for whatever had truly been pursuing them through the forest, Heinz says he suspects it was simply the beast after all. Even so, he openly admits that he has no idea how a creature like that could have appeared in that place to begin with. Still, since everyone made it out alive, he offers his thanks to the group. For the nobles standing there, gratitude from a prince is considered an honor of the highest order. To Van, though, it carries almost no value at all. Falk once again steps in to caution Van, telling him to be patient and stop behaving so disrespectfully. But instead of showing any interest in praise, favor, or approval, Van answers with complete indifference, as though none of it matters to him in the slightest. That reaction only makes Heinz even more curious. Instead of losing interest, he finds himself staring harder at this strange boy, wanting to understand what kind of person Van really is. By the time they make it back to the entrance of the forest, the candidates who managed to pass are already starting to gather there one by one, while the ones who failed stand off to the side with their heads lowered. Too ashamed to say a word, the second examiner quickly begins counting the numbers. And then the first examiner announces that, even with the prince included, there are still 4 candidates who have not returned. Hearing that immediately unsettles the second examiner, and a wave of anxiety flashes across his face as he starts to fear that something may have gone horribly wrong. After all, the forest was only supposed to contain monsters weak enough that Heinz himself could handle them without difficulty. He never meant for the prince to be placed in real danger because of what he had done. And just as that tension begins to spread, a lone figure suddenly steps out from between the trees. The second examiner instantly relaxes, assuming the one coming out first has to be Heinz. But instead, the first person to emerge is Van, who looks at the gathered crowd and mockingly asks if everyone came out here just to welcome him back. Unlike his colleague, the second examiner doesn't greet him at all. The first thing out of his mouth is a stunned question about how the boy is still alive. The first examiner clearly doesn't understand why that would even be asked, and Van immediately throws the question back at him, asking whether he was not supposed to be alive. Realizing he slipped up, the examiner hurriedly changes course and awkwardly dodges the issue, claiming he is simply impressed by what he is seeing. Van fires back right away, saying he isn't the only one who seems surprised here. Then the reason becomes obvious. Right behind Van, the noble candidates appear as well, dragging the corpse of the beast behind them through the dirt. The moment the crowd sees it, gasps ripple through the area as everyone recognizes the fake monster that attacked them inside the forest. Its severed head leaves no room for doubt. The proof is right there in front of everyone's eyes. And even though both examiners know exactly why that creature was there, they still put on a performance and pretend to be shocked. Even so, the second examiner can't fully hide himself, and the way he speaks comes off sounding almost like an accusation. When the first examiner asks him to repeat what he just said, he quickly retreats behind that same excuse again, insisting that he is only expressing surprise. At that point, Heinz steps forward and calmly describes the encounter as a magnificent battle. The second examiner nearly panics on the spot, the moment he sees that the prince is not only alive, but standing there unharmed. When someone asks how he became involved, Hines explains that he happened to be nearby when the fighting broke out. For the second examiner, that answer is nothing short of disastrous, because if it ever came to light that he was the one responsible for releasing that beast, then execution would be the only outcome waiting for him. Hines notices the man's shaken behavior immediately, and for the third time the examiner hides behind the same act, babbling about how shocked he is, and even blurting out exaggerated blessings for the kingdom's future prosperity. At that point, the suspicion hanging over him is impossible to miss. Hines then speaks honestly and makes it clear that his own role in the battle was actually very small. He stresses that the victory belongs to the 3 candidates who fought there, and above all, to Van. Neither the examiners nor the students gathered around them can accept that easily, and disbelief spreads across nearly every face in the area. Ralph openly praises Van without hesitation, while Falk bluntly admits that during the battle, he followed the boy's instructions. Under his breath, the second examiner mutters that something like that should be impossible for a Galda. But with a recommendation from House Steinhertz already attached to Van's name, even Hines sees nothing unnatural about it anymore. Van knows the truth better than anyone. Helene Steinhertz never actually taught him any of those techniques, but there is no way he can admit that now. Still, Hines's public acknowledgement, combined with that recommendation letter, starts to change how the people around them look at Van. The first examiner then steps forward, bows deeply toward Van, and thanks him in his capacity as a servant of the kingdom for protecting the prince. Van immediately tries to deny it, saying he did not protect anyone at all and simply managed to survive the ordeal himself. Even so, he lifts his flower into view, and that gesture prompts the other 2 boys to raise theirs as well. The examiners glance at one another in silence, and from that brief exchange alone, it becomes obvious that the second examiner is the one who now has to act. He starts calling out the names of those who passed, beginning with the prince, then the 2 noble candidates beside him, and finally, after a pause full of visible reluctance, he forces himself to say the last name, with his voice trembling in discomfort. He announces that Van has passed the entrance exam, and so, in the middle of all that confusion and chaos, the boy manages to secure a place for himself at the academy. As for the matter of the beast appearing inside the forest, the first examiner takes responsibility and says he will deal with every bureaucratic consequence that follows. Several days later, standing before the new generation of accepted talents, the academy's director delivers a formal speech and declares that this institution seeks more than simple ability. According to him, what matters most is true nobility of spirit, the kind of spirit that can become the kingdom's sword and shield. In his previous life, Van never once imagined that he would someday be standing in a place like this, surrounded by nobles. This was only a small first step, but for Van, it was still the beginning of the path toward his real goal, ending the discrimination suffered by his people. From high above the ceremony grounds, Helene watches the entire scene play out below, and a quiet, proud smile spreads across her face as she sees the result with her own eyes. Once she confirms that everything has unfolded exactly as expected, Helene turns away and heads off to answer the summons waiting for her. She steps into an opulent chamber lined with 5 seats, and one of those chairs has clearly been reserved for her. From the atmosphere in the room alone, it is obvious that every major member of that circle has already gathered there ahead of her. Among the people present is the sword princess herself, Karina Luthier. The silver strategist, Amelia Rodenwald, is there as well, seated among the others in silence. The stillness in the room is finally broken by Arnulf Clovius, whose calm and controlled presence seems to dominate the chamber, as he explains that they have assembled to discuss one matter alone. Completing the group is the 8th prince, Onus Ferrania, the one entrusted with foreign affairs. The moment Helene sees who is present, she already understands what this meeting is about. Amelia and Arnulf both agree that something unprecedented has happened. For the very first time since the academy was founded, it has accepted a student of Galda descent. Karina clicks her tongue and complains that the academy has become far too soft, and the 8th prince clearly shares the same opinion. More than that, Onus demands to know why a recommendation for that boy came from one of the Quintet Crown. His voice makes it plain that this is not a casual question. He expects Helene to justify herself. Because of that choice, Helene now finds herself in a very delicate position. The academy is packed with the sons and daughters of nobles, young elites, blessed with tremendous magical power and just as much pride to go with it. And when that much pride starts colliding in one place, conflict is bound to follow. To keep that kind of chaos under control, a group of idealistic students once stepped forward and took on the mantle of the Quintet Crown. So once again, Onus turns the discussion back to the same point and asks Helene what she was thinking when she recommended a Galda boy. Helene answers without hesitation that she simply recognized his strength for what it was. A reply Karina immediately treats as absurd. From Karina's point of view, the Galda are people cursed by the gods, beings who were never granted true power in the first place. Amelia agrees with that harsh view, and states plainly that without magic, no one can ever become the kingdom's sword or shield. Onus supports that line of thinking as well, because it matches the ideology the kingdom itself has long embraced. Helene pushes back at once, saying that belief is nothing more than a convenient excuse used by people too unwilling to think beyond the limits of accepted tradition. Her words hit the prince directly, and the look on his face shows clear offense. At that point, Arnulf calmly proposes what he sees as the simplest answer. They should test the boy themselves and judge him with their own eyes. Onus immediately approves of that suggestion and then turns to Helene to ask what she thinks of it. If Van turns out to be weak, then Helene's recommendation will come under heavy scrutiny. Even so, she offers no objection at all. Instead, she gives them a warning and says that whoever is chosen for this test must not underestimate him, or they will only end up humiliating themselves. To everyone in the room, Karina's next move comes as a surprise when she volunteers to test the boy's ability personally. Even the prince did not expect someone seated among those 5 chairs to step forward for something like this. Helene then asks Karina whether something about Van had specifically caught her attention. Karina answers in a cold, cutting tone that she simply wants to crush him, if only to wipe that confident expression off Helene's face. Meanwhile, back in the middle of the protagonist's daily life at the academy, the air is filled with the usual noise of student life, chatter about lessons, assignments, and work that still has not been finished. A full week has already passed since Van enrolled. To his own surprise, that first week has been relatively peaceful, aside from the occasional jab and provocation that never quite turns into anything bigger. And one day in class, the most arrogant instructor suddenly calls on Van and demands to know whether he can explain the theory behind the 4 elements in magic. The entire room drops into silence the moment the question leaves his mouth. It is the kind of question far beyond what first-year students are normally expected to answer. And even the teacher seems to realize a little too late that he may have overplayed his hand. Deep down, he had already assumed that a Galda boy would not even be capable of reading properly. Van stays completely calm and answers without hesitation, explaining that the theory is a method used to stabilize 4 core factors in magic: flow, density, resonance, and fixation. He goes on to add that this concept prevents magical stagnation, restores balance to magical energy, and forms the very basis of modern spell formulas. And he explains all of it with only the faintest smile on his face, as if none of it is difficult for him at all. From that moment forward, the constant harassment around him simply comes to a stop. More than that, Van gradually starts making friends of his own. One day, Ralph walks up to him, gives him a friendly pat on the back, and invites him to go have lunch together. Van remarks that he has actually been a little worried about both Ralph and Falk lately. When Ralph asks him why, Van avoids giving a direct answer and simply gestures toward the cafeteria instead. Van's answer clearly leaves Ralph Eisenbach blinking in confusion. But after a beat, he still hurries along behind him anyway, even if he does not fully understand what Van is thinking. That tiny stretch of peace does not last for long, because just as they continue down the hallway, a girl suddenly steps into view behind them and cuts off the comm. Van turns toward her and casually asks what she wants, still assuming at first that this is probably nothing serious, since the 2 sides only seem to have brushed past each other in passing. Trying to keep the situation from becoming a problem, both sides offer polite apologies, the kind people give when they want an awkward hallway encounter to end there. Then, without the slightest warning, the girl suddenly pulls out her sword and drives the tip right up to Van's throat, and the moment that steel appears, Ralph Eisenbach is thrown into instant panic. With cold arrogance, she declares that commoners are supposed to kneel when they stand before nobles. And in her eyes, someone from Galda should be doing even less than that, because she says the bare minimum would be lowering himself enough to kiss the ground. Even with a blade at his neck, Van answers in a calm, level voice that there is no reason for any of that. After all, everyone standing here is a student of the Magic Academy now, all under the same roof. But the girl refuses to let that matter, insisting instead on reminding him exactly where she believes he belongs in the hierarchy. Seeing how ugly the scene has become, Ralph Eisenbach finally speaks up and says outright that this has already gone way too far. She answers that she has no desire to draw blood, but only as long as Van shows the obedience she believes someone of his standing should naturally display. But that is obviously the last thing Van intends to do. Ordinary respect between upperclassmen and new students makes sense to him, yet the instant someone tries to force that kind of hierarchy through intimidation, every instinct in him pushes hard in the exact opposite direction. So instead of backing down, Van leans his body forward into the blade itself. Startled, the girl jerks the sword back at once, so he cannot seize it. But Van still catches the motion, twists the weapon with precise timing, and knocks it offline anyway. Her posture immediately falls apart, and in that startled reflex, her fingers clamp even tighter around the hilt. That sudden shift throws the weight of her whole body onto the narrow blade, and with both bending force and torsion hitting it at once, the sword reaches its breaking point and snaps clean in 2, so smoothly and so effortlessly that it is almost like watching vegetables split under a razor-sharp kitchen knife. Van glances at the ruined blade and asks whether zinc was mixed into it. Then, with open contempt in his voice, remarks that being threatened with something this ordinary is honestly pathetic. He goes on to explain that zinc blades are cheap and good at taking impacts, which makes them useful for drills and training. But in actual combat, they are dangerously unreliable. The girl fires back that real swords are forbidden on campus, and adds, almost defensively, that she is not one of the Quintet Crown. As far as she is concerned, that alone means her part in this confrontation is already over. And right at that moment, Karina Luthier appears. The instant she arrives, she calls for punishment, saying Van has shown disrespect to a senior and has also damaged another student's property. Ralph Eisenbach can barely process what he is seeing, because the legendary sword princess herself is suddenly standing right there in front of them. Van, however, recognizes her at once, not from rumor, but from the blood-soaked battlefields of his previous life, where countless people had died by her hand. And because of that, he cannot stop himself from wondering what someone like Karina Luthier is doing inside the academy at all. Back in Van's first life, when he lived as an assassin, the kingdom was shaken again and again by a series of rebellions. Operating in the shadows behind those uprisings was a militant remnant of the Purification sect, a group known as the Circle of White Annihilation. And among all of them, the most terrifying figure was Karina Luthier, a demonic swordswoman whose blade had cut down innumerable heroes. The kingdom did eventually wipe out the Circle, but the price was enormous, and the chaos left behind became the spark that set off the war over the succession to the throne. Van himself had only laid eyes on her once before, and that single meeting happened on the battlefield. So even now, standing here in the present, he still cannot understand why someone who should have become an enemy of the kingdom is here. Breaking through that heavy silence, Karina Luthier coldly announces that one more punishment still needs to be added. According to her, even standing there in silence before a senior counts as another form of disrespect. Van immediately apologizes and explains that he simply did not realize she was someone of higher standing. But instead of calming her down, that explanation only seems to irritate Karina Luthier even more. Ralph Eisenbach hurriedly jumps in, his voice tight with nerves, and tries to explain that she is one of the Quintet Crown. Van bluntly admits that he does not even know what that title is supposed to mean. So they briefly explain that the Quintet Crown is the Academy's disciplinary council, made up of the most outstanding students in the entire school. They add that Karina Luthier has belonged to it ever since she enrolled at only 13 years old. That actually draws a genuine look of surprise from Van, and Karina Luthier, oddly enough, thanks him for reacting that way. By now it is obvious that she comes from the very highest ranks of the nobility, a status that must have been hidden away after she later became a rebel. For the briefest instant, a dangerous thought flashes through Van's mind. This might be his chance to kill her here and erase the rebellion before it can ever begin. If Karina Luthier were removed now, then the succession war might never happen at all, and Heinz Ferrania might never get the chance to rise to power. Even so, Karina Luthier continues talking about punishment as though nothing else matters. She says that continuing to chatter in front of her is by itself yet another insult added on top of the others. At that, Van quietly shifts his body into a defensive stance, and Karina Luthier warns him that she is about to remind him exactly why she alone is permitted to carry a real sword. The stance she takes is unmistakable. Van recognizes it instantly as the very same posture she once used before unleashing execution blows so fast they were impossible to see. Ralph blurts out for Van to stop making things worse and just apologize already, his voice echoing through the tense hall. Van brushes his friend aside without hesitation and says there is something he needs to confirm for himself first. To Karina, that answer sounds utterly ridiculous. The kind of reckless nonsense only a fool would say at a moment like this. The two of them stand at opposite ends of the corridor, locked in a hard stare, while the students around them fall completely silent and watch with tight, breathless tension. Then, in less than a blink, Karina vanishes from where she stood and appears at the far side of the hall in an instant. By the time anyone can even process what happened, her sword is already back in its sheath. A second later, Van drops to the floor with a wound, and Ralph immediately rushes over to him while Karina remains silent and unreadable. Yet, instead of pressing the attack or finishing things there, she abruptly decides to put off his punishment for another time. In her own judgment, Van is not someone who needs to be exterminated on the spot. With that, Karina turns away and leaves together with her subordinate, while Van is left behind on the floor, injured, tense, and unable to settle his thoughts. A few minutes later, once they have gone some distance, the subordinate finally asks why she chose to spare a mere novice. Only after they are well away from the scene does Karina at last reveal what really happened. Without warning, she drops to her knees and clutches at her body, pain suddenly twisting across her face. She did not let Van off out of mercy at all. The real reason she stopped is because she herself was hurt, a truth that leaves her subordinate completely stunned. Karina explains through the pain that she once read of something like this in martial arts texts, a technique that targets pressure points with terrifying precision. The pain running through her body is so severe that even moving properly has become nearly impossible. Her subordinate, still trying to make sense of it, asks if that means the two of them traded direct blows during the clash. Karina answers with complete certainty that no, that is not what happened. The instant she closed the distance, her full intention had been to strike straight at Van's neck, but at the very last moment, Van ducked beneath it and countered without the slightest hesitation, aiming directly for one of her vital points. Her body reacted on instinct and forced her to pull back, and that split-second retreat changed the path of her blade. At the same time, Van's hands came in with flawless control, landing precisely toward the pressure point he had targeted. That motion was the beginning of a combined technique, the kind taught only in certain highly specific sword schools. It is not knowledge Van should have had any way of knowing. To the subordinate, Karina is obviously the winner because she is still the one standing. He says the result speaks for itself, and Karina outwardly agrees with him. But deep inside, she knows perfectly well that the real truth is not that simple. A strike aimed at pressure points is not meant to kill, which means Van had tried to bring her down without leaving permanent damage behind. If this had been an actual battle to the death, the outcome might have turned out very differently. And more than anything, the thing that sticks with her most is the fact that she had underestimated him. Irritated by that realization, Karina coldly declares that the next time they meet, she will come far better prepared. Back on Van's side, Ralph carries him through the academy corridors and asks what it was Van had wanted to confirm in the middle of that confrontation. He explains that he had been worried sick, and on top of that, he was naturally curious about what Van had been thinking. Van, however, brushes the question off as unimportant. Inwardly, he reflects that even though Karina spoke harshly, she never drew a real sword against him, and the magic he felt from her was different from the overwhelming terror she carried in his past life. That difference alone tells him she showed restraint. And almost absent-mindedly, Van even remarks that she was unexpectedly kind. That brief clash is enough to convince him that the Karina of this time is not the same monster he once faced. As Ralph carries him toward the infirmary, Van begins to wonder if there may actually be a way to change her future, instead of deciding from the start that he has no choice but to kill her. The following day, Van walks into the classroom and heads for his desk just like he normally would. Only this time, he can feel far too many eyes following him the moment he steps inside. He sits down at his seat near the edge of the room, only to hear whispers spreading all around him about how he challenged one of the quintet crown. All that attention immediately puts him on edge. Not long after, Ralph and Falk show up and tell him not to pay any mind to those idiots staring and whispering. From the look on their faces, both of them seem completely set on helping him find a way to apologize. Van makes it plain right away that apologizing is not what he plans to do. He even points out that when he first met the two of them, neither of them seemed anywhere near this meddlesome. Even so, he thanks them for worrying about him and says he will handle the whole situation by himself. If Van truly wants to stop that future tragedy from ever coming to pass, then he knows there is no avoiding it anymore. Sooner or later, he has to face Karina head-on here and now. And no matter how this turns out, Van still doesn't believe the Academy's disciplinary elites are enough to make him back down in fear. Right in the middle of that tense moment, the Lady of the Ice Flower suddenly appears and calmly asks Van to come speak with her. Van naturally questions the timing, pointing out that class is about to begin any second. Helene doesn't argue with him for long. She simply insists that it will only take a moment. Curiosity gets the better of him, and Van finally agrees, leaving the classroom together with her. That sight alone is enough to leave everyone in the room completely stunned. It is shocking enough that Van even knows the Lady of the Ice Flower at all. But what really throws everyone off is how casually and naturally he talks to her. Later, once they reach a quiet and secluded spot away from the others, Helene explains that she has been tasked with testing Van's abilities herself. Van answers with a dry remark, saying she could have just told him that from the start. Helene apologizes, admitting that she never expected things to spiral out of control so quickly, especially once Karina got involved. She goes on to describe Karina as the very peak of noble youth, a young genius already seen as the future head of the Luthier family, despite her age. Van says he cannot look at Karina as just some gifted prodigy to him. She feels like someone who has thrown away everything else in life and left only the sword behind. That observation catches Helene off guard, though after a moment she quietly admits that he is exactly right. Helene explains that Karina was originally born as an illegitimate child of the Luthier family, to the point that she was not even given the most basic education expected of a noble. And yet, when she was only 10 years old, she defeated her own 17-year-old half-brother in what should have been nothing more than a casual duel. That half-brother had been the legitimate heir, and because Karina's talent was impossible to ignore after that, the house finally recognized her as a true daughter. Even then, her life was never warm. She grew up surrounded by jealousy with no real affection to speak of, and when Van wonders how Helene knows so much, Helene lightly notes that nobles have always loved their gossip. Still, before Karina ever entered the Magic Academy, Helene once saw her alone at a gathering. The image stayed with her vividly. Karina, standing apart from the crowd by herself, quietly watching her father from behind with a hollow, empty gaze that no child should ever have had. Van says that if that was the case, then Helene should have spoken to her back then. Helene answers right away that she couldn't do that. As members of great houses, even a forced conversation could have been interpreted as a political challenge or deliberate provocation. Van can only call it what it is, an unbearably difficult situation. Helene admits that, at the time, she too was trapped by those expectations and obligations. Karina, on the other hand, never seemed to care much about chains like that. Helene quietly confesses that she had always feared the girl might someday end up walking a very dangerous road. Van then asks her what she would do if that day ever truly came. Helene answers without wavering that she would stop Karina herself, because she had already avoided that responsibility for far too long. At that moment, everything clicks into place for Van. Helene's magical talent had been on a level comparable to the heroes who would later shape the kingdom itself. And yet, despite power like that, her name never became widely celebrated. Van realizes what that must mean. When Karina eventually became a rebel in the future, Helene must have tried to stop her and likely died in that clash, leaving her no chance to create the legacy she should have had. Even while speaking words heavy enough to shake anyone listening, Helene asks Van not to look at her, with pity. Van says he understands, but also admits that hearing everything she said only hardens his resolve even more. Now, more than ever, he is determined to crush the regret, darkness, and twisted burden Karina carries inside her. In the previous timeline, no one had ever been able to stop her. But this time, Van believes he truly has a chance to cut that evil off at the root before it can fully bloom. Helene quietly lets slip that, somewhere in her heart, she may have been hoping to hear those exact words from him. She then asks whether Van already has a plan, and Van answers with quiet confidence that he would never move without one. So when Helene asks what that plan actually is, Van simply tells her to follow him after class. Once the day's lessons and activities finally come to an end, Van's classmates gather around him again. Falk mutters that people have started getting far too involved in Van's business lately. Ralph admits he is still curious about what happened after Van left with Helene, and Falk immediately agrees. A moment later, the two of them spot Van up ahead, but he isn't just standing there waiting for them. Instead, Van is already in the middle of a fight with the Lady of the Ice Flower herself. The instant their attacks collide, a violent shockwave rips outward and sends both of the boys stumbling backward, nearly throwing them off their feet. Helene lets out a dry, sarcastic remark, asking Van exactly where he thinks he's looking, even as cold magic begins gathering around her hand. Then she releases her ice spell, unleashing the Garden of 1,000 Thorns in a burst of freezing force. Ralph and Falk can do nothing but stare, completely speechless at the sight unfolding in front of them. At the very last possible second, Van darts forward and plants himself directly in front of the two of them. With one perfectly timed martial strike, he smashes through the spell and shatters the magic completely. Only then does he glance back at the two stunned boys and casually remark that they picked a perfect time to show up. And right after saying that, Van immediately tells them to join him. The sharp sound of footsteps rings down a long stone corridor as Karina walks beneath slanting sunlight pouring in through the tall windows. Then the eighth prince calls out to her in an easy, relaxed voice, greeting her as though this were nothing more than an ordinary passing encounter. Karina turns her head with a hard-cutting glance and asks whether he needs something, addressing him with formal respect as Your Highness. The eighth prince says he is not trying to hurry her, but he still wants to know when she plans to deal with the Galda they discussed earlier. Karina answers that it will be very soon, then adds that the item she had requested from her family has finally arrived. Hearing that, the prince reacts with quiet interest, clearly intrigued by the news. Just then, a student lurches forward into view, bent at the waist and dripping with sweat, as she drags an ornate coffin wrapped in thick chains, the heavy metal scraping and clattering loudly across the floor. Struggling under the weight, the student asks Lady Karina where she wants it taken. Karina calmly orders her to carry it to her room, making it clear that it must be handled with great care. The eighth prince keeps his eyes on the chained coffin and quietly remarks that this must be the object he had been hearing rumors about. Then questions whether bringing out something like that might be excessive, even for a Galda. Karina answers at once that it is not excessive in the slightest, not for someone like him. For someone who feels like a naked blade given human shape, she says, there could be no more fitting stage than this. Not long after that, the eighth prince shows a faint, knowing smile. Soon a notice spreads across the academy, and students begin gathering one after another in front of the announcement board. The posting declares that Karina Luthier, one of the Quintet Crown, has challenged first-year student Van Kruger to a duel as punishment for disturbing public order. It also names the location, the Royal Academy's Grand Training Grounds, the White Ring Arena. The notice further describes it as a sacred ground, a place reserved only for official duels and special trials. Under the open sky, Van stands alone in the middle of the arena, calmly stretching his limbs and loosening his body while the wind moves quietly around him. Nearby, the eighth prince takes his seat and watches in silence, saying nothing as he observes the scene below. Little by little, the stands begin to fill, and Helene quietly notes just how enormous the crowd has become. Beside her, Falk and Rolf whisper to each other that the mood in the arena feels oppressively heavy, and one of them mutters that nobody here honestly believes this is going to be a fair duel, when the other asks what exactly he means by that. Helene answers in a flat voice that this was never a duel to begin with. This is punishment. To most of the people watching, a fight between one of the Quintet Crown and a Galda could only end one way, as a completely one-sided slaughter. Ralph clicks his tongue at that idea and says that might be the conclusion ordinary people would reach, but Falk firmly insists they already know better than that, with a confident grin spreading across his face. He says Van is not the kind of person who can be measured by common sense. Helene lifts her eyes toward the higher seats and quietly comments that it seems someone else feels the same way. Up above, Heinz stands watching the arena with an easy, relaxed smile on his face. The 8th prince notices him and silently wonders why a man like that would bother coming to watch a duel like this. As he keeps staring upward, his expression gradually hardens. Sensing his brother's gaze, Heinz turns and smiles at him. And that simple expression only irritates the prince even more. Then, all at once, a crushing pressure falls over the white ring arena. The air itself seems to tremble. The crowd stiffens, and even Helene sits rigidly beside the two students, staring without blinking. Nearby, the 8th prince leans forward in his seat, his whole posture tightening as the atmosphere in the arena turns dark and ominous. Down on the arena floor, Karina stands with her eyes closed, one hand wrapped around a chain while faint violet lights drift and shimmer around her. The chain drags harshly over the stone with a brutal scraping sound, and Ralph, staring wide-eyed, blurts out a question about what that thing could possibly be. Helene breaks into a cold sweat at the sight, thinking to herself that Karina couldn't possibly have brought that out here. There, in the very center of the arena, rests a gigantic coffin, and the heavy chain attached to it lies coiled in Karina's grasp. Facing her with a thin, almost amused smile, Van remarks that it must be his coffin, adding that it is surprisingly considerate of her to prepare one. Karina shoots him a sharp glare and coldly orders him to stop joking around. As violet light starts boiling out from the coffin and blades begin rising from inside it, Karina declares that a coffin like this is far too good for someone like him. For a brief moment, even Van is stunned into silence, frozen by what he is seeing. The name Sword Coffin seems to loom over the entire arena as its interior unfolds into a radiant armory. It is revealed to be a portable armory, an artifact passed down through generations among the sword saints of the Luthier family. Falk mutters under his breath in utter disbelief, wondering what in the world the sword saints had been thinking when they created something so monstrously insane. Karina reaches straight into that raging storm of violet light and pulls out a sword, and the hatred burning in her eyes is so intense it almost feels visible. With that blade in hand, she coldly declares that she is going to make him regret everything down to the very day a Galda first dared to set foot inside this academy. Van answers her in an equally cold voice, saying she has no right to talk about regret, and swears that he will smash her precious sword coffin to pieces. Then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he asks how the signal to begin is supposed to be given. Karina tells him the match has already begun, and the moment the words leave her mouth, her body moves. She bursts forward in a blur with her blade leading the charge, while the violet circle behind her flares brighter and the chain lashes violently through the air. Van's red eyes narrow at once, and in the next instant, he slips completely out of the sword's path, as if he vanished. Then he reappears so close to Karina that she is forced to twist her body in the middle of her swing just to keep up with him. His fist slams into her sword with a sharp explosive burst that cracks through the arena floor. Van lets out a cool remark saying that, just as he expected, her reflexes really are exceptional. Karina gives him nothing in return. Not a word, not even a change in breath. She only hardens her stare, and the two of them reset for a heartbeat before rushing at each other all over again. Up in the stands, the students recoil in alarm. One of them shouts that the exchange is way too fast to follow, another blurts out that it looks exactly like instant movement magic, and a third fires back that it cannot possibly be magic because Van is Galda. Falk grabs at his head in disbelief and says that no matter how many times he watches it, it still looks exactly like magic to him. Someone finally names the movement Phantom Step, and Helene calmly confirms that yes, that is exactly what it is called. The boy beside her can only stare and ask what that is even supposed to mean. The explanation follows. Most people move by pushing off the ground first, which creates a visible preparatory motion that the eye can catch. Van does not move that way at all. Instead, he slides his whole body forward by manipulating his center of gravity and rotating his pelvis. And that hidden body control is revealed to be the real nature of his footwork. Ralph says that even after hearing the explanation, he still cannot understand it, adding that this is footwork so absurd they cannot even properly read it from where they are. Falk immediately agrees. Helene narrows her gaze and observes that, for Karina, seeing that happen right in front of her must feel almost identical to being confronted with teleportation. As she watches, she recalls that the first time she witnessed it herself in the Galda forest, she had felt exactly the same thing. Down on the arena floor, the battle suddenly compresses into tight close-range exchanges. and Falk judges that this development should favor Van, because close quarters are where he holds the advantage. Ralph points out the obvious problem on Karina's side, saying that at this distance a longsword should not be able to swing properly. But Karina adapts instantly. She slides one hand higher up the blade and grips the unsharpened section near the hilt, without hesitation, then drives the weapon forward with compact, disciplined power instead of relying on a full swing. Van's expression tightens the moment he sees it, and he braces himself to catch the blow at point-blank range. The clash grinds violently between them, metal and force scraping together in a brutal burst. Van kicks himself backward to open space again, and Karina immediately asks if he really thought she would be unable to cut him just because they were fighting up close. Van gives a tense, uneasy smile, while Ralph blurts out in surprise that what she just used was half-swording. It is then explained that a long sword has an unsharpened section called the ricasso, and half-swording is the technique of gripping that section directly so the blade can be controlled more precisely in cramped, close-range combat. Ralph adds that while it is definitely practical on an actual battlefield, it is not the kind of technique noble ladies are usually taught. Falk follows that up by saying maybe the rumors about Karina becoming the next sword saint are true after all. Helene cuts through that speculation at once and flatly states that, against Van, this is actually a poor choice. Karina pushes forward with that tightly controlled style, but Van slips inside her angle before she can fully dominate the exchange and answers with pure speed, closing the gap so fast that her stance has no time to fully settle. The moment he crashes into her space, the force of the collision ripples across the arena tiles, and Van drives straight through her guard, striking hard enough to break her balance. Karina's body is thrown upward and backward by the impact. Van chases after her, without giving her even a second to recover, shouting that he is not done yet as he keeps the pressure on relentlessly. From the stands, the eighth prince watches all of it with his arms folded across his chest and quietly remarks that Van truly is not finished, especially now that Karina is being forced to take direct hits. Beside him, it is explained that magic swordsmen have a particularly hard time avoiding attacks that carry no magical power at all. That is precisely why Van's blows, which contain nothing but raw physical force, become so difficult for them to read. Karina plants herself again and steadies her footing, her aura swelling around her as she scoffs, and asks what difference something like that is supposed to make. With full confidence, she declares that attacks relying on nothing but physical strength could never possibly break through her magical defenses. But in the same instant, her eyes suddenly widen as a chilling sensation runs through her body. For one brief, disorienting moment, Karina freezes in place as though her own senses can no longer properly process what just happened to her. She slams her sword against the ground to steady herself and stares ahead in open disbelief. Then she grabs the side of her head and demands to know what Van has done to her, while Van answers with nothing more than a faint, knowing smirk. He casually says it could be anything, then almost lazily suggests that maybe her mana control is simply sloppier than she thought. Karina grits her teeth, caught between rising fury and real confusion over what her body is suddenly experiencing. The technique is identified as Could, Empty Hall. It is explained to be a method where a palm strike generates concentrated wind pressure and sends that shock into the semicircular canals of the inner ear, disrupting a person's balance and throwing off their sense of orientation. All across the arena, shocked gasps ripple through the crowd as Karina is forced backward step by step. One student blurts out in confusion, asking what in the world is happening, while another shouts in total disbelief that Lady Karina is actually being pushed back. From high up in the stands, the eighth prince suddenly loses his temper, glaring down at the arena as he angrily demands to know what Karina Luthier thinks she is doing. To him, this isn't just a duel anymore. It looks like she's dragging the dignity of the nobility through the dirt. Not far from him, Heinz Ferrania says nothing at all. He simply stands there with his arms folded, watching the scene below with a faint grin curling across his face. Down on the arena floor, Karina Luthier bends slightly at the waist, her body still thrown off from the lingering dizziness. One arm shifts as if to guard herself while she tries to steady her balance, and for a brief moment, her posture shows that the disorientation has not fully left her yet. Van Kruger takes that opening and moves in with measured calm, one palm raised as he closes the distance. Even now his expression stays composed, and in an almost casual voice he asks her whether they should bring this to an end soon. The moment Van steps closer, a purple-haired girl in the audience jolts in alarm and cries out for Lady Karina. Her voice cuts through the tension as she watches him advancing, clearly terrified of what might happen next. At that instant, something in Karina's face changes. The haze in her expression vanishes, and what replaces it is sharp, cold, and dangerous, like the edge of a blade suddenly being drawn. Then a magic circle flares open above her, and a brutal surge of violet light bursts outward from it. In an instant, that violent purple radiance spills across the arena and swallows the entire space in a blinding flood of power. Karina drops her body low without hesitation and drives her strength downward through the sword, forcing that gathered power straight into the ground beneath her feet. The arena floor explodes, stone tiles rip apart and blast outward in a crushing wave. the impact chewing through the battlefield until the once solid floor is torn open into a gigantic crater. All around the arena, the spectators can only stare at the devastation below. The destruction is so overwhelming that one stunned student barely manages to choke out that he cannot believe what he is looking at. Van is forced backward by the sheer force of it, stumbling as he throws his arms up in front of himself. Even he looks visibly rattled, shaken by the violence of what just erupted in front of him. In that moment, Van realizes something crucial. Karina had not even landed a direct blow on him. All she had done was swing a sword overflowing with magic, and yet the shock from that alone was enough to shake him deep to his core. That is when it clicks for him. Why the sword saints of past generations needed the sword coffin in order to handle power like this safely. Without something like that, no ordinary weapon could truly bear such force. Amid the raging storm of mana, Karina rises into view and names the technique herself. With complete confidence, she declares it to be Himmelster's, the Heavenfall blade. As if to make the point even clearer, she calmly adds that what everyone just saw proves its one and only flaw. Ordinary swords simply cannot endure the strain of that technique. Watching from above, the 8th prince murmurs under his breath that this is the real Karina after all, and only then does he realize she had been holding back the entire time. Beside him, another calm voice agrees without missing a beat, remarking that anyone who took that strike head-on would be blown away like dust. Van steadies his breathing, regains his footing, and looks straight at Karina before telling her that she really should take better care of her weapon. Karina answers that she will. Then a thin smile spreads across her face, and there is something chillingly certain in the way she looks at him. With that same terrifying calm, she declares that the next strike will end everything. A suffocating silence settles over the arena. It feels as if the entire stadium has stopped breathing at once. One student stares at the towering pillar of power around Karina and panics, blurting out in disbelief whether she truly intends to kill him. Another student only sneers, saying that this is the natural punishment for a Galda who dared to stand against a noble. Nearby, Ralph Eisenbach turns pale, his face draining of color as he thinks that if an attack like that lands, Van will die for sure. Falk Waltraich quickly tries to calm everyone down, insisting that Van could still avoid it, as long as the blow does not connect directly. In Falk's mind, Phantom Step is still Van's best chance of surviving this. No one can know for certain yet. Only the next moment will decide it. Helene Steinhertz watches the duel without even blinking, and quietly points out that Van's attacks have been getting through, but they still do not carry enough force to put Karina down in a single hit. Then she adds the more frightening truth. Karina's Heavenfall blade, if it lands properly, could wipe Van out in an instant. Helene goes on to explain the real danger. Karina could knowingly endure Van's attacks just long enough to unleash Heavenfall blade at point-blank range. And even if Van somehow avoided the direct edge of the strike, the shockwave alone would still be lethal unless he had magical protection strong enough to withstand it. Falk swallows hard, his throat tightening as he stares at the arena, and wonders out loud what Van is planning to do now. Below them, wrapped in a swirling violet haze, Karina faces Van once again and gives him one final warning. She tells him to accept the status he was born into. She says that if he does that, then she will spare his life. Van cuts his eyes toward her and answers with a dry remark, saying she is obsessively fixated on status as if it is the only thing that matters. Karina immediately shoots back that such a way of thinking is perfectly natural. In her eyes, magical power is decided by bloodline, and that belief is not just personal opinion. It is part of the very foundation this kingdom stands on. Van lets out a short, bitter laugh at that answer. To him it sounds exactly like what a noble would say, so predictable that he can barely hide his contempt. Then Van steps forward and confronts her directly, asking whether she truly believes that merely acting like a noble is enough to make her one. Karina goes silent. Just for a moment she freezes, and then she sharply demands to know what he just said. Van does not back off. He tells her plainly that he knows the truth, that she is half commoner. Then he presses the wound even deeper, saying that this is exactly why she clings so desperately to the idea of becoming a true noble, all in the hope that her father might finally acknowledge her. The moment those words land, Karina's face twists violently. It is as if something buried deep inside her finally breaks, and raw rage surges through her whole body. She starts shouting Van's name in fury, her voice trembling with the effort of trying and failing to contain herself. A violent flood of mana pours out across the arena, so sudden and intense that the surrounding students can only stare in confusion. None of them can even make sense of what they are hearing anymore, and they begin asking in bewilderment what those two are even talking about. Helene Steinhertz keeps her eyes fixed on the fight, watching every movement with sharp focus as she realizes exactly what Van is doing. He is provoking Karina on purpose. More than that, he is trying to force out an attack from her with absolutely no restraint left in it whatsoever. Ralph panics the moment he understands the direction this is heading, crying out in disbelief and asking why Van would do something that reckless. Then Falk realizes it too, and dread immediately settles over him as he understands that Van is preparing to use that technique. Inside Karina's mind, the truth she has buried for so long rises up like poison. She admits it to herself at last. Within noble society, she has always been treated as something foreign, something that never truly belonged. And she recognizes that this is the reason she had once felt sympathy for Van. Even though he was a Galda somewhere in him, she had seen the same kind of exclusion reflected back at her. She remembers that this is also why she volunteered to test him in the first place. At the time, she had intended to settle things without killing him, but now her face hardens completely as she decides that Van never understood and never appreciated that mercy. Her eyes flare with fury as she declares that if even he dares to insult her like this, then he should come forward and face her. Her mana erupts again, even more violently than before, lightning beginning to crawl and crackle along the blade as she screams that if death is what he wants, then she will kill him exactly as he wishes. Van lowers his stance and charges straight into that storm of power instead of retreating. He answers her without hesitation, saying yes, he is coming. At the same time, Karina gathers a raging violet glow around her sword, rises above him, and then brings down the Heavenfall blade from overhead. The blow drops like a guillotine from the sky, absolute and merciless. But in the instant it falls, Karina's eyes fly open in shock, because Van steps directly into the attack instead of trying to flee from it. Spectators explode into panic at once. One of them shouts in disbelief that this is sword snatch disarming done with bare hands, then immediately insists that a technique like that should never be possible in a real fight. Deep down, Van Kruger agreed with that much. In any real fight, nobody could just casually stop a falling sword barehanded. But what he had done wasn't that simple, and he immediately makes it clear that the move had worked for a very specific reason. He explains that the first step was syncing his own hands with the blade's motion, matching their relative speed as closely as humanly possible. Then, from the very instant his palms touched the weapon, he began breaking its momentum apart, and in that microscopic sliver of time before the sword could finish its full swing, he scattered the force and absorbed the impact instead of taking it head-on. The method had a name too. Stillgrip, the zero-style grasp. It was the very same technique Van had used earlier when he brought all of Helene Steinhertz's ice spears crashing down at once. Even so, Van remarks that the Heavenfall blade really is an absurdly powerful technique. But in the end, that overwhelming destructive force was exactly what made it vulnerable and doomed it to fail. Karina Luthier blurts out that something like that should be impossible. But by then Van is already moving. He twists his body through the leftover force, still tearing through the clash, and smoothly turns that same pressure back against her. A brutal shockwave explodes across the arena the moment Van's counter lands, and the impact is so fierce that it sends Karina hurtling backward through the air. A heartbeat later, she slams down hard onto the ground. Then, forcing herself back up, she drops to one knee and lets out a painful groan, her body clearly reeling from the blow. All around the arena, the students can only stare, their faces frozen in pure disbelief at what they've just witnessed. One of them can barely believe the sight in front of him and whispers that the thousand-blade sword princess has actually been driven down to her knees. Another student, just as shaken, wonders aloud if this really is the power of that Galda. Nearby, a purple-haired girl stiffens and stammers out Karina's name in alarm, while Van's two friends yell at him from the sidelines, warning him not to relax now and urging him to keep pressing the attack. But Van does not charge in for the finishing blow. Karina, still breathing rough and uneven from the impact, lifts her head and demands to know why he isn't ending the match right there. With irritation and pride mixing in her voice, she asks if he's trying to show her mercy. Van flatly tells her that it's nothing like that. Then, without softening his tone at all, he adds that he has no interest in beating down some half-finished noble lady. He goes on to say that she still hasn't shown everything she can really do yet, so Van urges her forward, telling her to come on, because what he wants to see is not this version of her but the real Karina. Karina shoots him a sharp glare, calls his words unbearably presumptuous, and then turns her eyes toward the massive violet gate behind her, the ominous sword coffin standing there like a waiting tomb. Magic circles begin spiraling through the air one after another as she reaches into the coffin's eerie radiance. Then, from within that glowing depth, she slowly draws something out. Watching from the side, the eighth prince lowers his voice and whispers in shock that she actually pulled it out. The person beside him murmurs that this is the first time she has ever seen the real thing with her own eyes. And even she sounds unsure whether Karina is truly serious about going this far. The students around them begin recognizing the weapon just from its reputation alone. Ralph Eisenbach starts to say its name out loud, while Falk Waltraich admits that even he has heard of it despite not being a swordsman himself. Helene Steinhertz confirms their reaction at once, saying they have every right to be alarmed. She explains that the blade Karina is holding is one of the most famous swords in the entire country, the signature weapon of the sword saint himself, Sternkreis, the star ring sword. She goes on to describe it as a spring sword, forged from an extremely thin, highly flexible special metal, unlike that of ordinary blades. Van studies the weapon in silence, and a memory from his previous life surfaces immediately. Back then, that same sword had been known by a far bloodier name, the Massacre Sword, Bloodchain. Karina raises her eyes toward him and declares that she'll show him. She says she'll show him exactly what she had to sacrifice in order to stand where she is now. Van answers calmly that he understands. Then, as he faces her with the coffin-like arsenal looming behind her, he tells her that he'll witness all of it with his own eyes. Behind Karina, that coffin-like arsenal towers over the arena, making her figure look even more imposing as she stands in front of it. Crimson lightning begins to coil and gather around Karina's blade, crackling more violently by the second, as she declares that this is her full power. With absolute confidence, she throws down a challenge, and tells Van to endure it if he truly thinks he can. At once, a savage red spiral bursts into existence and tears across the arena floor. The air seems to grind and scream under its force, and the spectators flinch back as the pressure swelling over the stone becomes almost suffocating. Seeing that terrifying scene unfold, Van realizes that this may very well be the price of his own overconfidence. Lean Steinhertz immediately identifies the art Karina is using as Circle Requiem, a national-level magic technique. She explains that it is an ultimate art so difficult that only a tiny number of people in the luthier family can ever reach it. She adds that the technique works by using magic to push the spring sword's flexibility even further, accelerating its tip until it moves at supersonic speed. Karina announces that once someone enters the dance of the circle, no one inside that domain is spared. Her voice turns even colder as she declares that it makes no difference whether the target is flame, lightning, or anything else at all, because the circle cuts everything down just the same. Then she warns Van that the field is still expanding, and before long it will spread until it covers the entire arena. Even now, she gives him one last choice if he is willing to admit defeat and run. She says she'll let him live if he does. But with a chilling final note, she adds that if he stays where he is, not even his bones will remain behind. Van answers without hesitation that she doesn't need to waste time letting it spread any further, because instead of waiting for her attack to come to him, he says that he'll go to her himself. Then he steps straight into the raging current of blades and pressure. As he reads the flow around him, he notes that it's undeniably fast, but not so fast that it's truly impossible to see. He names the state he is forcing himself into tekshipsikia. In his own mind, he explains that it's a phenomenon where the brain's processing speed spikes drastically when a person is pushed under extreme stress. It's basically a survival mechanism, one that lets a human being search for the best possible path through an otherwise overwhelming flood of incoming information. Most people only ever experience that state by accident, in some desperate life or death instant. But Van has gone far beyond that. He has mastered how to trigger it on purpose whenever he needs it. His eyes sharpen to a razor edge, telling himself to move, Van launches forward and bursts directly into the circle. The very next instant, a violent clash rings out, and the shock of it ripples all the way into the stands. The eighth prince can hardly believe what he's seeing and mutters under his breath that Van actually deflected it. Heinz Ferrania narrows his eyes and observes that Van isn't trying to parry the whole sword at all. He's only knocking away the very tip. Amid the storm of attacks, Van keeps his focus razor thin and explains it to himself. With a spring sword like this, the center of gravity never truly leaves the tip. He warns himself not to get tricked by the sword's tangled, unpredictable path. Even as the crimson blade keeps bending through those complicated arcs, Van Kruger forces his eyes to stay locked on it and keeps reading its lethal trajectory one strike at a time, intercepting it before it can tear into him. Staring straight into those flashing red slashes, Van comes to a clean conclusion. He doesn't need to stop the whole attack at all. All he has to do is keep smashing the tip away again and again, and the rest of the blade will fail to land where Karina wants it. The next moment he lunges deeper into the storm, drives his hand straight into the blade's line, and knocks the sword point off its path. Karina Luthier stumbles inside her own circle, her footing breaking for an instant, and in stunned disbelief she blurts out that he's a monster too. Van shuts that down immediately. He tells her he's not some monster, that he's only pushed himself harder than most people ever would, just like she has. Karina bristles at that answer right away. Her face tightens and she snaps back, demanding to know exactly what he means by that. Without backing off, Van tells her that a spring sword is the kind of weapon that chooses its wielder. If someone tries to use it without genuine mastery, the blade won't obey them. It'll slice its own user apart first. Then he presses the point even harder. Being born into a famous swordsman's bloodline, he says, is nowhere near enough to reach a level like this. Then over the screaming clash of steel and magic, Van shouts at her directly, asking how many years she poured into mastering that one single sword. Karina freezes. The question catches her so completely that, for a brief moment, even she realizes she has never once stopped to count. And just like that, an old memory comes rising back to the surface. She remembers that her father only ever taught her how to hold a sword once. Just once in her entire life. Maybe it had only been a passing whim to him, something done on impulse and forgotten right after. But to her, that moment stayed vivid, because in that one brief instant, she truly felt as if there had been a bond between them. But after that day, it never happened again. Her father was consumed by affairs of state, and a bastard daughter was not someone he had time to spare himself for. So Karina tells herself that she chose the sword anyway. She believed that if she became stronger than everyone else, then surely her father and the entire house would have no choice but to acknowledge her. She remembers the endless days of hellish training that followed, and in that memory she admits something bitter to herself. She became too strong. Contemptuous stares around her did disappear eventually. But what replaced them wasn't acceptance or warmth. It was fear and hatred, clinging to her from every side. And along with that, she remembers something even colder, that the warmth that once existed in her father's eyes disappeared too. Her eyes burn as another memory surfaces. The day her father finally acknowledged her as a legitimate heir, even though she was still the daughter of a mistress. And in her heart, she thinks that was probably the absolute most he could force himself to give her. For the sake of peace within the family, she tells herself, he held back the trueborn children, calmed their mother, and chose to turn away from her instead. In her mind, that had been the correct choice for him to make. And when she finally understands that truth, she realizes the only thing she ever truly had left in her hands was the sword. Inside her own mind, she sees herself standing before a throne, believing that once she reached that place, no one would be able to deny her existence anymore. She vows to prove her worth through power so absolute it can't be argued against, because to her, that is the one and only road that leads to recognition. Then the arena rushes back into focus. Rage floods across Karina's face, and she screams at Van, demanding to know what he could possibly understand about any of that pain. Crimson light erupts around her in a violent burst as she flips through the air. From that motion, she brings her blade crashing down in a savage, relentless cascade. A blinding storm of slashes rips through the space between them in flashing bursts of red. The sheer pressure hurls Van backward, and as he skids under the force, he grits his teeth, eyes stretched wide, a strangled sound catching in his throat while he stares up at the cuts raining toward him. The blade starts opening his skin as he twists and braces against it, forcing his body upright instead of falling around him. Red lightning tears across the floor and walls, carving bright scars through the arena as he endures the onslaught. Karina's eye tightens when she sees that he's still standing through all of it. And for the briefest flicker, her expression wavers as if even she can't fully process what she's looking at. At the edges of the arena, the students recoil in alarm. Ralph Eisenbach blurts out that Van is still moving forward, while Falk Waltrate stares in open disbelief and says that he's actually forcing his way through that storm of slashes. Panting hard, Karina turns her head and shouts that she can't understand why he would go this far. She says everyone else has always run from her sword, and then demands to know why a man with no magic still refuses to retreat. But Van keeps advancing. His shoulders stay squared, stubborn and unbroken, even as red arcs crawl and snap across his uniform. At first, he tells himself the reason is simple, that he has to stop the future rebellion before it ever begins. But almost as soon as that thought appears, he corrects himself, realizing that it isn't just about that anymore. A vision of his homeland flashes through his mind, a desperate land exploited by evil until nothing was left. And with that memory comes the quiet certainty that suffering is something he understands better than anyone. So he fixes his eyes on Karina and realizes that at the very center of this violent storm, someone is crying. And once he sees that, he knows he can't bring himself to turn away and leave them there. Karina lashes out with another swing, her voice cracking as she shouts that she is not crying. Van answers her without slowing down for even a second. He tells her she is, and says that if she won't admit it herself, then her sword is screaming in her place. Then he pushes the words even further, asking if even this still isn't enough, because that sword is crying out loud enough for anyone to hear. Those words slam into her harder than any physical blow. Her lips tremble, and a sharp, voiceless reaction catches in her throat before she can force it out. Karina bares her teeth, fury and humiliation twisting together across her face until the two emotions are impossible to separate. She spits back that he has no right to act like he understands her. Then she screams that this sword is all she has, that she used it to become stronger than anyone, and that she'll force the entire house to bow before her. The red field swells even more violently around her as she lowers her stance. You can feel her dragging every last bit of power she has into the next strike she's preparing to unleash. Van raises both arms against that crushing pressure and forcibly steadies his breathing. Blood and sweat slide down his cheek together, but he still does not stop. He forces his voice out through the pain and admits that no, he doesn't know everything. But even so, he tells her to listen, calling her by name, Karina. And with absolute sincerity, he tells her that her worth is not something anyone else gets to decide. He steps forward again, his boots grinding over cracked stone, and keeps speaking. He tells her that the sweat and tears she shed where no one could see still matter, that every swing she made while it felt like her soul was being carved away still carries weight, and that no one has the right to deny the value of that struggle. For a fraction of a second, Karina freezes completely, her eyes widening as though he struck something far deeper than flesh. And Van, fierce but honest, keeps going, telling her that even if no one else in the world acknowledges it, to him she is the finest magic swordsman he has ever seen. At those words, the violent crimson glow wrapped around Karina starts to falter. Her grip tightens around the sword, and her breath catches sharply in her chest. At the very edge of Karina Luthier's mind, a memory flickers back to life. Soft warmth, a smaller hand being carefully guided into place, and a voice speaking close enough to feel almost beside her ear. In that distant scene, her father calls her by name Karina and quietly tells her to listen well, as though what he is about to say matters more than anything else. Wrapped inside that warm old memory, she hears him tell her that even when she cuts down an enemy, she must never swing her sword with anger or hatred in her heart. He tells her to be noble. He says that even in the middle of battle, pride must remain inside her. And with his hand resting over hers on the hilt, he teaches her that this is the sword of the Luthier family. Then the present rushes back all at once. Wind and dust sweep across the shattered arena floor as Karina and Van Kruger stand facing one another at close range amid the broken stone. Karina slowly steadies her breathing, and in that moment she finally realizes that this was what her father had been trying to teach her all along. She thinks about pride again, and understands that it was never something she was meant to beg from other people in the first place. It was something she was supposed to carry within herself so she could remain who she truly was. Tears stream down her cheeks as she admits, deep inside, that she finally understands now. What she threw away with her own hands was the very lesson her father once gave her. With her shoulders squared and her eyes no longer shaking, she looks straight at Van Kruger and tells him clearly and sincerely that she is grateful. She says that because of him she was able to remember, and then she tells him that he brought her back to the sword she had truly wanted to wield from the very beginning. Pink glow begins to crawl along her blade, then swells outward into a fierce crackling aura that wraps the weapon in bright, living light. Karina tightens her grip until her knuckles turn pale, and with a voice full of resolve, she declares that this time she will pour absolutely everything she has into this technique. She asks if he can receive it. Van meets her eyes without even the slightest flinch, lowers his center of gravity, and answers that he will gladly take it. Karina lets out a sharp cry and drives herself forward. The attack that follows is a simple overhead slash, plain in shape at first glance, yet honed so completely that it has been refined to the absolute limit. It is the one and only technique her father ever personally taught her. She brings it down with every last bit of strength still left in her body, drawing a blazing line through the air as the sword falls. The strike comes down with such force that it feels as if the arena itself is being split straight down the middle. As Van watches that descending line of death fall toward him, the corners of his lips curl slightly, and he says to himself that this right here is the real Karina. The collision bursts outward in a violent explosion of wind and light. The gale lashes Karina's twin tails wildly as the slash tears past, and inside that chaos, Van moves with unbelievable precision, slipping through the narrowest possible opening before delivering his own strike. For a brief moment, the two of them remain completely still. Then, a heartbeat later, Karina's knees finally give out beneath her. The strength drains from her arms and she falls forward face first onto the broken arena floor. Her breathing comes out ragged and uneven as she admits, without trying to deny it, that this is complete defeat. Even so, she manages to turn her head just enough to speak, and tells Van that she is thankful. Van walks over to her and offers out his hand, telling her that the feeling is mutual. He adds that her sword was magnificent, and when he says her name, Karina, there is no mockery in it at all, only straightforward respect and recognition. All around them, the students remain frozen where they stand. One person mutters in disbelief that a member of the Quintet Crown has actually been defeated. Another, even more stunned, adds that it happened at the hands of a first-year student, and worse still, a Galda. For a moment, a strange silence hangs beneath the blue sky. Then Heinz Ferragna starts clapping, slow at first, each clap deliberate and clear. The sound carries through the stunned arena. One by one, more hands begin to join in, until the applause spreads row by row and swells into a wave. Van pulls Karina back to her feet, and there in the center of the ruined arena, the two of them clasp hands while cheers and applause rise all around them. By the very next morning, after that now legendary showdown, Van is already back on his feet, as if nothing happened. Anyone seeing him now would have a hard time believing that just yesterday afternoon he fought like a man thrown into a magical blender. He stands there comfortably with his two loyal companions, Ralph Eisenbach and Falk Waltraich, while both of them hover around him with the restless excitement of overjoyed dogs that just found a ball to chase. Trying to calm them down, Van casually flexes one arm and tells them that the Magic Academy's healers handled everything perfectly. According to him, their healing magic wiped away every single injury so cleanly that he doesn't even have so much as a tiny scratch left behind. Falk can barely hold himself together. His eyes are shining as he blurts out that yesterday's duel is absolutely going to become one of the most legendary moments in the Academy's history. He insists that future students are going to whisper about that fight for years to come. But Van just shrugs the whole thing off and says it was nothing more than an ordinary duel. His friends reject that immediately. They argue that there is nothing remotely ordinary about a first-year beating one of the Quintet Crown. From where they're standing, what happened feels less like a duel and more like reality itself glitched for a second. Their excited admiration cuts off all of a sudden when Falk notices something nearby. Standing beneath a tree is a girl with unmistakable pink hair, and the sight of her instantly pulls everyone's attention. It's none other than the Thousand-Blade Sword Princess herself, Karina Luthier. Even after being defeated in front of the entire academy the day before, she looks surprisingly healthy, calm, and composed. Ralph and Falk react at once, both of them stiffening in alarm. In nervous voices, they whisper that maybe she came back for a rematch, ready to challenge Van again and settle the score. Van, on the other hand, doesn't show even a hint of that concern. He simply greets her in a casual tone, like someone approaching an old acquaintance at the training grounds. Karina walks straight toward him with a stern expression, her face carrying the rigid seriousness of someone here to inspect a problem personally. The first thing she does is criticize him, saying that he was late in offering a proper greeting, and that his attitude lacks the level of respect expected inside the academy. So when Van jokingly wonders if she plans to punish him again, she suddenly drops a declaration so unexpected that everyone around them is left stunned on the spot. Her cheeks flush bright red, almost as red as a ripe tomato, and she points straight at him. Then, with determined seriousness, she announces that she has decided to appoint him as her knight. The moment those words leave her mouth, a thick wave of confusion crashes down over everyone there. Inside the academy, the squire system is supposed to be a proper mentorship arrangement, at least on paper. An upperclassman is assigned to a younger student so the senior can guide them, watch over them, and help them adjust to academy life. But the way the princess presents it, the real meaning is impossible to miss. What she is basically declaring is that, from this point on, she plans to keep Van under her eyes at all times, and not just to observe him either. She fully intends to step in and personally straighten out what she sees as his completely unacceptable behavior. Van understands the implication almost instantly, and that realization hits him hard. To him, this does not sound like guidance at all. It sounds like permanent surveillance, and the look on his face turns into that of someone whose brain has just frozen mid-thought at 99%. While Van quietly spirals over the horrifying idea of never having privacy again, Ralph and Falk lean in and whisper to each other with obvious excitement. To them, this whole thing might actually be a huge stroke of luck. From their perspective, if the Academy's fearsome sword princess personally claims him as her squire, then that alone would be enough to make every other student think twice before messing with him. No one would want to pick a fight with someone standing under her protection. The princess, meanwhile, keeps speaking with the same proud, absolute confidence. She tells Van that he should consider it a tremendous honor to have been acknowledged by her in the first place. Then, without leaving any room for debate, she demands that he swear his loyalty on the spot and formally accept the role. Van hears every word, and he does take the offer seriously for a moment. Even so, no amount of prestige means more to him than his own freedom, so he gives her a polite refusal. And then, without wasting even a second, he unleashes what may as well be his secret ultimate technique, turning around and running for his life at full speed. As he dashes off toward the distance, Van shouts at the top of his lungs that he has absolutely no intention of living under somebody's constant watch. And just like that, he leaves the princess rooted to the spot, staring after him in complete disbelief. Her stunned silence only lasts for the briefest moment. The very next instant, she refuses to let him get away that easily, and launches straight after him in pursuit. She tears across the academy grounds at full sprint, yelling that he is not allowed to run from her guidance. As the two of them race off, Ralph and Falk watch the scene unfold and start trading increasingly suspicious looks, lowering their voices. They begin to wonder if her stubborn determination is really just about discipline and training. One of them even suggests that maybe, just maybe, the princess has developed a serious crush on the very boy who managed to beat her. While that absurd chase is causing chaos outside, the mood inside the Quintet Crown's meeting room could not be more different. The air there is tight, heavy, and full of barely restrained tension. Prince Leonis sits at the table shaking with visible fury, and when he speaks, his outrage is unmistakable. To him, the result of that duel is intolerable, because a member of what he sees as a slave race defeating a noble is not just humiliating, it is dangerous. He goes on to insist that this is not some minor embarrassment that can be brushed aside. In his eyes, it threatens the very foundation of the kingdom's social order. Jonas argues that the hierarchy of the realm is supposed to stand on magical power. That, according to him, is the principle everything else is built upon. So if someone with no mana whatsoever can bring down a noble blessed with overwhelming magical talent, then the authority claimed by the royal family and the noble class starts to look far less absolute than they want people to believe. The frustration boiling inside him finally erupts, and he slams his fist down against the table hard enough to make his anger impossible to ignore. He then turns that anger toward Helene Steinhertz, the Ice Flower Lady, accusing her of trying to undermine the nobility itself by allowing Van to enroll in the academy at all. Not far from him, the purple-haired student who somehow always wears sunglasses indoors reacts far more calmly. In an almost casual tone, he wonders how a complete newcomer could possibly possess such polished and disciplined combat technique. He points out that Van fights less like an ordinary student and more like a trained assassin. Amelia Rodenwald, however, the red-haired elite seated among the quintet crown, shows no sign of being rattled by that observation. She simply lifts her tea and drinks with the poised elegance of someone who seems to view everyone else in the room as beneath her notice. In that same cool tone, she explains that Van's talents are not truly threatening to real nobles. According to Amelia, a true noble commander is meant to be both shield and hammer at once, the kind of figure who can stand in front of the people to protect them while also crushing entire hordes of monsters through sheer power and leadership. Compared to that ideal, she dismisses Van outright as nothing more than a skilled street brawler. She continues, saying that his style might have value in the shadows, especially for assassination, but on an actual battlefield it would amount to nothing. Amelia's view: there is no world in which someone like Van could ever replace the nobles who serve as the nation's supporting pillars. And to prove exactly where his limits lie, she proposes using the coming Legion training exercise as the perfect test. That Legion training is no harmless school drill either. It is a practical combat operation where the students organize into military-style units and head out to hunt dangerous magical beasts for real. Amelia makes her intention perfectly clear after that. She plans to place Van in her own squad so she can expose his shortcomings publicly and make everyone see them for themselves. Just then, the atmosphere in the room shifts the moment Prince Heinz Ferrania walks in. The blonde prince enters with such effortless ease that he looks less like someone stepping into a closed elite meeting and more like someone casually posing for a royal portrait. Even though the room is supposed to be reserved only for the highest-ranking members, Heinz wears an easy smile and lightly asks whether he and his companions might be allowed to join Amelia's unit during the Legion training. He says that her earlier words about the resolve and duty of the nobility moved him deeply. The way he describes it, Amelia's speech hit him like some grand revelation that opened his eyes on the spot. Amelia is visibly pleased by the attention the prince is giving her. His praise flatters her immediately, and she accepts the request, declaring that she will personally educate that troublesome boy, while the prince watches it happen with his own eyes. Heinz does nothing more than stand there smiling, but that smile gives off the unmistakable feeling of a man who could betray someone with perfect manners. Beneath that pleasant expression, it is obvious he is plotting something messy, complicated, and almost certainly disastrous for somebody. Meanwhile, back outside on the academy grounds, that lively pursuit eventually runs its course. Not long after, the pink-haired princess finally succeeds in catching the one person she has been chasing. After that, the scene settles into a much calmer mood at a tea gathering hosted by Helene Steinhertz, the Ice Flower Lady. Van sits at the table looking perfectly at ease, completely absorbed in nibbling on a biscuit with the single-minded focus of a squirrel stockpiling food for winter. Nearby, his two noble companions, Ralph and Falk, listen closely as the details of the upcoming Legion training are laid out. Falk starts by making one important thing clear. This is not going to be some harmless mock battle where students only pretend to fight. He explains that, during the exercise, the students will actually be placed in command of real soldiers from the kingdom. Van finally pauses his biscuit long enough to make sure he understands what he just heard. He remarks that, from the sound of it, this is basically an internship meant to train future battlefield commanders. Helene gives a small nod and confirms that his interpretation is correct. Then she reveals the final and most ominous detail. The operation will be carried out in the Lament Wetlands, a dangerous magical wasteland whose very name sounds grim, and a place far more perilous than the forest used in the Academy's entrance exam because the entire region is saturated with dense magical energy. Helene Steinhertz explains that the wetlands are saturated with unstable mana, so thick and turbulent that they become the ideal breeding ground for dangerous magical beasts. According to her, creatures like that flourish in this kind of environment, and once their population swells beyond a certain point, they start spilling out of the marsh and pushing into other lands. She goes on to say that those outward migrations do not stay small for long. In the worst cases, they turn into full-scale stampedes, violent enough to trample towns and wipe out entire civilized regions. That is exactly why, she says, the nobility bears such a serious duty. Noble forces are regularly sent into the wetlands to cull the monster population before those roaming waves can spiral into catastrophe. In other words, this hunting is not for glory, but to stop disasters before they ever have the chance to begin. While Helene explains all of this, Van calmly keeps eating through another snack like it is just part of the lesson. He gives a small nod, still chewing, and tells her to keep going with the details. Helene Steinhertz then shifts the topic and begins laying out how the Legion training itself is structured. She explains that every first-year student will be placed in charge of a small squad. Above them, the upperclassmen take those individual squads and organize them into larger military formations, known as companies. At that point, Ralph brings up the exact question that has obviously been sitting in everyone's mind the whole time. He asks straight out whether doing well in the Legion training can earn a student fame, status, and real recognition at the academy. Helene immediately confirms that it absolutely can, and she says this is exactly how many students first make a name for themselves. She explains that every current member of the Quintet Crown first drew attention during their own first-year Legion training, but right after that she adds the catch that makes the whole thing more complicated. The upperclassmen commanders personally choose which first years they want to bring into their companies. The moment Van hears that, he assumes the system is going to work against him. In his head, he can already picture himself being picked dead last, like the kid nobody wants on their side during gym because everyone acts like he is carrying something contagious. As far as he is concerned, a Galdo with no magic would obviously end up shoved into the pile of leftovers. Helene quickly shuts that assumption down. She tells him that, in reality, quite a few senior students are already interested in recruiting him. Van just stares at her in complete confusion, so baffled that his two companions have to jump in and spell out what should already be obvious. They remind him that he is the student who beat the Sword Princess and killed a demon during the entrance exam. To the rest of the academy, he is already halfway to becoming a legend. In their eyes, he is this strange, impossible fighter who can bring down powerful enemies without using even a single trace of magic. Van can only stand there in silence, too stunned to say anything back. In his previous life, people treated him like he was barely even there. Like background furniture no one noticed unless they bumped into it. And now, somehow, he has turned into the one person everybody wants on their side. Little by little, Van starts to realize that the world around him really is changing. But along with that realization comes another one. Not everyone is pleased to see him rising this fast. A sharp warning runs through him all at once. The kind of instinct that tells him someone is watching. He lifts his gaze toward the distance and almost immediately his eyes meet Prince Leonis on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Leonis is visibly shaken for a split second. He cannot believe Van sensed him at all, especially when the prince had not used any magical method of detection. Even so, Leonis recovers quickly and buries that surprise behind a hard expression. Grinding his teeth, he mutters that Van and his little group should enjoy their friendly games while they still can. Back at the table, Helene Steinhertz offers a way to get rid of all the uncertainty surrounding the company draft. She explains that, as a member of the Quintet Crown, she has priority when it comes to her selections. Then she plainly states that she intends to draft Van, Ralph, and Falk into her own unit herself. Ralph and Falk instantly light up at the thought of joining such a powerful company, and for a moment they are openly thrilled, but that excitement lasts only a few seconds before a familiar voice cuts right through it. The Sword Princess, Karina Luthier, steps up beside the table with the firm, unshakable air of someone arriving to make an official claim. She declares without hesitation that supervising Van is her responsibility, because he is her squire, and because of that, she insists that he should naturally be placed under her command. Van immediately objects. He protests loudly, reminding everyone that he already turned down the whole squire offer earlier. Unfortunately for him, nobody around the table seems remotely interested in respecting that objection. Helene just laughs softly and remarks that the princess's proposal sounds interesting too. She treats the whole thing like an amusing little dispute, completely ignoring Van's increasingly desperate attempt to defend his personal freedom. Several days later, the academy courtyard is packed with students pressing in around a huge bulletin board where the official Legion assignments have finally been posted. The crowd is so large, it is hard to even get a proper look at the board. As they make their way through, Falk comments that being personally chosen by a respected upperclassman is considered a major honor. So the three of them scan the posted rosters, fully expecting to find their names under Helene Steinhertz's company. Then Van suddenly stops cold. His name is not there. He looks again, this time much more carefully, tracing down the list name by name to make sure he did not miss it. But it is still not there. Next, he checks the roster for Karina Luthier's company, only to find that his name is missing from that one too. Right then, a heavy, unpleasant feeling starts sinking into his stomach. Slowly, Van raises one finger and points toward the roster for the fifth company. Ralph and Falk follow where he is pointing, read the heading, and go pale on the spot. In complete disbelief, They ask if this is supposed to be some kind of cruel joke. The commander of the 5th Company is Amelia Rodenwald, the red-haired elite noble who openly believes commoners should stay beneath people of noble birth. Then Falk notices something even worse. He points at the name written right beside Van's, and it is Prince Heinz Ferrania. Van stares at the board in disbelief. He has been assigned to the same company as the traitor who caused his death in his previous life. And on top of that, the commander is the noblewoman who already clearly despises him. To Van, it feels less like an assignment and more like a nightmare arranged with him specifically in mind. And as if the tension itself had called them in, Prince Heinz Ferrania appears at the scene with Amelia Rodenwald beside him. The blonde prince steps forward wearing a pleasant smile that looks far too sharp to be comforting, like a shark spotting wounded prey in the water. In a cheerful voice, he comments that this really must be quite the coincidence. Van turns to face him with the kind of expression that says he has just swallowed an entire lemon whole. Heinz Ferrania and Amelia Rodenwald walk up with perfect politeness, but the atmosphere around them feels deeply unsettling, like officials arriving to deliver news nobody wants to hear. Heinz keeps that bright, easy smile on his face, acting as though the entrance exam, where he had already killed once before, had just been some light-hearted chance for everyone to get acquainted. Then he extends a hand and says they should work together and do their best during the training. Van does not mirror that warmth for even a second. He looks at the offered hand like it is a piece of garbage he has no reason to trust. All Van gives him is a short, dry acknowledgement, and he makes absolutely no move to shake that hand. After that, Amelia Rodenwald formally introduces herself as one of the Quintet Crown. Van bows politely and apologizes for having arrived late to the gathering. Amelia brushes the apology aside with a casual wave of her hand. She says she has no taste for stiff formalities. But the very next moment, she follows that up by coldly reminding him not to forget his place as a mere Galda. In her eyes, his role in the company is extremely simple. He is to stay out of everyone's way, obey her orders without question, and serve as nothing more than a scout. Before the conversation can turn any more openly hostile, Helene Steinhertz steps forward. The woman who had personally opened the academy's doors to Van, Helene Steinhertz, steps in and asks Amelia whether she might be being a little too hard on him. Amelia does not back down even slightly, with a calm, almost matter-of-fact expression. She explains that this attitude is, in her mind, an act of kindness. She genuinely believes that people without magic become dangerous weak points in battle, the kind of burden that could put an entire squad at risk when real fighting begins. Because she believes that so firmly, Amelia says she is actually being generous by assigning Van to sentry duty. As Van listens to her explanation, he quickly realizes that Amelia is the most exhausting kind of person to deal with. There is no mockery in her eyes, no cruelty, no petty enjoyment in trying to humiliate him. That is what makes it worse. She truly, honestly believes she is right. Van answers her in a calm voice, saying that every position inside a unit has value. He goes on to say that this exact belief is one of the reasons he chose to enter the Magic Academy in the first place. In that moment, he remembers Helene once telling him that magic is not the only road to reaching the top. Holding on to that thought, Van tells Amelia to keep watching him as closely as she wants with those elitist eyes of hers. He states it plainly. He is going to prove that he is anything but useless. Amelia, however, shows no sign that she wants to continue arguing with him. She simply turns her back on the spot and walks away without another word. Prince Heinz follows after her with the easy, natural loyalty of someone trailing right behind a superior. But before he fully leaves, he pauses just long enough to offer Van a warm little reassurance, telling him not to worry and saying that his talents will surely be useful sooner or later. Still, the way Heinz says it sends a chill through the moment, like he is not offering comfort at all, but quietly measuring Van for a funeral. As the two of them walk off, a pair of onlookers remain standing to the side, watching in silence. Karina Luthier, the pink-haired sword princess, narrows her eyes and studies the exchange carefully. She has the distinct feeling that the prince is scheming again behind the scenes. Beside her, Helene Steinhertz comes to a similarly uneasy conclusion. She realizes that Heinz must have pulled a significant number of strings inside the academy to meddle with the company assignments this thoroughly. While those two worry over the politics behind the arrangement, Van stands there without saying a word. His thoughts begin to drift, dragged backward into memories from his previous life. He remembers exactly what happened the last time troops were dispatched to the Lament Wetlands. That mission had ended in total disaster. In the middle of the operation, an entirely new species of monster had appeared. Something no one had predicted, and it tore through the forces sent there. Almost no one survived. The incident became a historic tragedy, a complete annihilation that later helped ignite a devastating civil war. Not long after the assignments are posted, Rolf and Falk come over to Van, both of them visibly worried about how he is taking all of this. They check on him carefully, expecting frustration, anger, or at least some sign that he is upset. But Van barely seems to register their voices at all. His focus is fixed somewhere far beyond the present moment. Instead of dwelling on insulted pride or damaged reputation, he is quietly running survival calculations in his head. It does not take him long to realize that the careful plan he had built for himself has already fallen apart. His original strategy had been simple enough. Stay close to the strongest people available and avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Now that route is gone. If that unknown monster from his previous life appears again, then hiding behind powerful allies will not be enough to save anybody. Van shifts his eyes toward his two loyal companions, and the problem becomes painfully obvious to him at once. Ralph and Falk, with all their eagerness and straightforward optimism, would never make it through a disaster like that without suffering serious injuries. They are simply not ready for what is coming. And to make things even worse, Van has now been placed in a company where he is treated less like an officer and more like hired help. All the while, the danger waiting in the Lament wetlands is far beyond anything the Academy believes it is sending them into. Then, when the day finally comes for the army to move out, Amelia steps forward in front of the assembled soldiers to speak. She delivers a sweeping speech packed with talk of noble pride, sacred duty, and the honor of serving the kingdom. Her words fire up the troops around her almost instantly, and the soldiers answer with loud cheers and surging enthusiasm. Unfortunately, the men placed under Van's command react in a completely different way. Instead of looking inspired, they start grumbling openly among themselves the moment the speech is over. They do not even bother to keep their voices down. Several of them openly mock the idea of serving under a leader who has no weapon in hand and no magic to rely on. One soldier sneers that marching under a Galda with empty hands makes the whole mission feel ridiculous, while another mutters that they have basically been dumped into a disposable unit before the battle has even begun. Van says nothing at first. He just listens quietly while the insults keep piling up. Eventually, once he decides they have said more than enough, he steps forward and calmly reminds them that he is now their commanding officer. He tells them flatly that the time for useless chatter is over. Then his tone hardens, and he orders them to shut their mouths and focus on the mission like soldiers who actually deserve a place in the kingdom's army. That finally brings silence down over the squad, although a few of the men still cling to smug little expressions as if they are not ready to let go of their contempt. From farther away, Amelia watches the entire scene with a cool, measuring gaze, taking it all in. To her, this only confirms what she already believed. She sees the squad assigned to Van as a pile of the worst soldiers available. Men with no future in the military and no real hope of ever rising through the ranks. In Amelia's mind, the fact that Van ended up with such a hopeless group is proof enough that he has already reached the limit of whatever ability he might have as a commander. Without pausing to second-guess anything, Amelia raises her voice and gives the order for the army to march. Her command rings out loud and clear, full of authority, and the surrounding forces answer her with another roaring wave of cheers. Van's squad, however, offers none of that energy back. His men stay completely silent, carrying themselves with all the excitement of people being marched into a tax audit rather than into military service. As the army pushes deeper through the forest, Amelia eventually calls for a brief halt so the troops can rest. The second the break begins, Prince Heinz slips right into his usual polished routine. He moves through the camp with that smooth, practiced charm of his, stopping to speak with soldiers from different squads. He politely reminds them to drink water, stay sharp, and keep themselves ready, all while presenting the image of an ideal prince carrying out his royal duty. Watching him, it feels less like seeing a battlefield commander and more like watching an impossibly polished camp counselor guiding a group of eager campers. Elsewhere in the camp, the other squad leaders spend the break checking their gear and speaking with their own men, doing what they can to keep spirits steady before the mission continues. Van's squad paints a completely different picture from the rest of the camp. His men sit huddled together in grim silence, their faces weighed down by frustration, resentment, and the sinking feeling that they have already been written off. Before long, the grumbling starts up again. One soldier bitterly points out that they are being forced to march on foot while their captain gets to watch everything from horseback. Another mutters that their leader clearly contributes nothing useful at all. Eventually, one of the soldiers loses patience and raises his voice, demanding to know whether their captain plans to say anything at all in his own defense. Van answers without anger. In a steady, composed tone, he says that he has heard them and noticed they all seem to have plenty of complaints to share. He then tells them that he is willing to hear them out once before the mission moves forward. That invitation blows the whole thing wide open. The soldiers start venting all at once, shouting about their gear, and insisting that their armor and weapons are outdated junk. One man angrily spits out that their leader is nothing more than a useless magical outcast. Another soldier says what several of them are clearly already thinking, that the academy must have stuck their squad in the role of expendable shields so the noble students can stay safer. Then, with all the bitterness stripped bare, he admits he is not even sure he will survive this mission. Van listens to all of it in silence, lets the last complaint hang in the air, and then quietly climbs down from his horse. Facing the squad directly now, he tells them he understands why they are anxious, but he also says they are completely wrong about how this is actually going to play out. In that moment, Van realizes words alone are not going to move them. So instead of arguing any further, He decides to prove his point with something they can see for themselves. Calm as ever, he tells the entire squad that they are free to attack him all at once. The men just stare at him, too confused to respond at first. Then one especially irritated soldier finally snaps, grits his teeth and charges straight at him. He swings his sword with real force. The attack so aggressive it is obvious he is not testing Van at all, but trying to run his own captain through. Van moves instantly. With shocking ease he catches the blade in his bare hands, as casually as if he were plucking a drifting leaf out of the air. The attacking soldier freezes where he stands, his face twisting into disbelief as he tries to process the impossible sight in front of him. Somehow his captain's hands feel stronger than steel. Van gently takes the sword away from him, and with one clean motion, shoves the man down onto the ground. Then he turns back toward the rest of the squad and, still perfectly calm, asks whether anyone else wants to give it a try. Nobody steps forward. Most of the men just stand there looking like their souls have briefly abandoned their bodies. To make sure the lesson really sinks in, Van takes that same worn sword and walks over toward a nearby tree. With one loose, effortless swing, he cuts through the trunk. The blade passes through the wood so cleanly it barely seems to resist him at all. In an instant, the tree is left split apart like neatly prepared firewood, and the reaction around him is immediate. The soldiers can only stare at Van in stunned, speechless silence. Even people from nearby squads start turning their heads to watch, wearing the sort of amazed expressions usually reserved for watching some famous performer do the impossible. Van walks back over and returns the sword to its owner. In the most casual tone imaginable, he remarks that the weapon may be a little old, but it still works just fine. After that, he explains that the way he fights now was not something he chose because he was lazy. He tells them he trained with every weapon he could get his hands on, mastering one after another, before ultimately deciding that fighting empty-handed suited him best. Then Van ends it with a clear promise to the whole squad. He has absolutely no intention of letting any of them die pointless deaths. He adds that the only way any of them are ending up as monster food is if they do something stupid like wandering off and getting themselves killed. From the top of a nearby hill, Amelia Rodenwald watches the entire exchange from a distance. Her face stays cold, sharp, and openly critical the whole time. To Amelia, Van's little display does not prove leadership at all. If anything, she takes it as evidence that he is still an amateur commander, someone trying to control his men through fear instead of earning their respect. In her mind, a squad held together by intimidation will crack the moment a true crisis hits, and the soldiers will turn on their commander the first chance they get. As far as Amelia is concerned, Van has already failed as a leader. Eventually, night falls, and by then the army has reached the outer edge of the Lament wetlands. The soldiers set up camp right along the border of the swamp, with darkness settling in over the marsh and the whole area taking on an uneasy stillness. Under the glow of lantern light, Amelia and Heinz Ferrania sit over maps and discuss the next stage of the mission. And even in the middle of that planning, the prince gives off the same relaxed air as someone leisurely reading a book, looking completely at ease while everyone else prepares for danger. Meanwhile, over by a much smaller fire, Van's squad gathers together in a separate little circle. A few of the soldiers quietly start wondering whether their captain has finally grasped just how dangerous this mission really is. One of them jokes that Van may have already given up on them and slipped off into the dark to save himself. Another lets out a bitter laugh and says that their whole squad is made up of disposable misfits anyway. He goes on to say that having a Galda as their captain is actually pretty fitting for a group of rejects like them. And then, at that exact moment, Van suddenly steps out of the darkness behind them. He appears so quietly that several of the soldiers nearly jump out of their seats. Calmly, Van asks them what exactly they meant when they called themselves outcasts. The conversation dies on the spot. The men freeze where they are, and Van simply walks over and lowers himself beside the fire. But he has not come back empty-handed. Without any dramatic announcement, he drops several freshly caught rabbits and a bundle of wild mushrooms onto the ground in front of them. The whole squad stares at the pile of food with wide, stunned eyes, so shocked they look like they have forgotten how to blink. Soon, a pot of stew is bubbling over the campfire while meat roasts over the flames on skewers, filling the night air with a smell the men clearly were not expecting. Van waits until everything is ready, then looks at the squad and tells them it is time. The soldiers only stare back at him in guarded silence, but Van ignores the tension, starts handing out bowls, and tells them to eat. He adds that half-starved men are never going to have enough strength to survive tomorrow's battle. Then he holds out a bundle of herbs and tells them to stuff the leaves into their boots and rub them around the inside, explaining that they help prevent blisters. One of the soldiers blinked at him like he had completely lost his mind, then frowned and asked what had suddenly gotten into him. With clear suspicion in his voice, he accused Van of trying to butter them up with a bowl of food. Van lowered his eyes for a moment before answering in a quiet, steady tone. He said he knew exactly what it meant to keep marching until the skin on your feet split open with blisters. He went on to say that he also knew what it was like to be handed rations so hard they felt like rocks. And when your luck ran bad, he added, that same food could tear up a man's stomach badly enough to leave him half dead before the fighting had even started. At that, the soldiers suddenly went quiet. The mood around them changed in an instant. After a short pause, one of the men muttered under his breath that it was hard to believe someone as young as Van had already seen a real battlefield. Another soldier glanced at Van and pointed out that he was Galda. If that was true, the man said, then living through something like that would not be surprising at all. Their captain then cut into the conversation and asked Van directly if this was pity. He challenged him, asking whether Van was looking down on them because he had once been trapped in the same miserable position. Van answered him without wavering. He said it was not pity at all. It was an investment. Deep down, though, he admitted to himself that he was doing this for the sake of his own objectives. In his mind, he saw them as pieces he would place carefully on the board until the day he cornered his enemies and delivered checkmate. Even so, he made himself one promise he would not break. He would never treat these men like disposable pawns. He would bring every last one of them back alive. Then Van extended the bowl toward them once more and told them plainly that, if they wanted to survive what was coming, they should become his pieces for now. He assured them they would not regret that choice. The men could only stare back at him, stunned into silence by what they had just heard. After a brief pause, one soldier finally let out a rough, scratchy laugh. Repeating Van's line about becoming his pieces, he asked if that was seriously supposed to sound funny. Van gave him a blunt answer and said he did not know. The man smirked at that and said he had never seen a Galda boast that boldly before. Off to the side, another soldier spoke up and asked whether they were really expected to put their trust in a captain like this. Someone else answered almost immediately by tossing back a simple question of his own. Did they have any better choice? As the men finally started eating, one of them added between bites that at the very least Van was strong and he could cook. He even said Van might already be more dependable than some pampered noble with a fancy title. Van watched them in silence, saying nothing as they ate, and reflected on a lesson he had paid dearly to learn in his previous life. Ordinary soldiers were nothing like nobles. Their lives were not something you could gamble away with grand speeches about the nation or the people. What they truly wanted was much simpler than that. More than anything, they wanted to make it home alive to the families waiting for them. That was the greatest wish they had, and in truth, it was the only one that mattered. That was why Van thought the way he did. He never tried to win over men like them by preaching lofty ideals or noble causes. The only things that could truly earn their faith were undeniable strength and a real promise that they had a chance to survive. At the forest camp, the soldiers moved quickly through the morning light, tearing down tents as pale sunlight filtered between the trees. Amelia Rodenwald gave a crisp order for everyone to finish breaking camp and remain on standby until her signal. The men answered at once that they understood. A little while later, the troops reported back that the entire camp had been dismantled. They told her they were prepared to move out at any moment. Van answered them with a calm, approving smile and said they had done well. He then ordered them to hold their current positions until further instructions. Stay alert and keep a careful watch on the surroundings. The men responded sharply and immediately fell in behind him as he moved off. Watching that from a distance, Amelia Rodenwald could not hide her surprise. She found herself thinking that he had managed to whip that unruly pack of misfit thugs into shape in the span of a single night. Prince Heinz Ferrania then walked up from behind and quietly remarked that Van truly seemed to possess the makings of a commander. Amelia Rodenwald only agreed with that halfway. She said his real value would not be known until it was tested on an actual battlefield. Not long after that, she called all of the squad leaders to gather before her and announced that she was about to issue the operation orders. The officers gathered around a large map laid open across the clearing. Pointing over it, she explained that their destination beyond the forest was the Lament Wetlands. She told them that most of that region was inhabited by gremlings and that swamps were scattered all across the area. She continued her explanation by saying that visibility throughout the wetlands was generally good. Even so, the entire region was still a magical wasteland. Because of that, she warned them to assume that even an ordinary patch of grass could be hiding a beast. Only after making that danger clear did she move on to the actual plan. She explained that, as the Legion Vanguard, their duty in this mission was to confirm the presence of enemies inside the wetlands. Their unit, she said, would advance in a wedge formation and drive straight through the area in one direct push. That declaration sent a visible shock through the gathered soldiers. Some of them blurted out in disbelief that they were being sent straight into enemy territory. Prince Heinz Ferrania calmly commented that this was a forceful reconnaissance operation. Amelia Rodenwald immediately confirmed that he was correct. She then laid out the full meaning of the plan. A forceful reconnaissance, she explained, meant deliberately pushing into enemy territory and judging the enemy's strength by how violently it responded. She openly admitted that the method was dangerous, but said it was also the fastest way to understand the enemy's true scale. Fortunately, she added, the ground in the Lament Wetlands was relatively firm, which meant horses could still pass through it. As long as they avoided the scattered marshes and small streams, she said breaking through the entire area in a single sweep would not be especially difficult. Once she finished the explanation, Amelia Rodenwald looked over the gathered leaders and asked if anyone had any questions. Van raised his hand. He then asked why they were choosing forceful reconnaissance instead of relying on normal scouting methods. Amelia Rodenwald answered right away without even a moment of hesitation. She explained that the wetlands were too vast and too full of places where monsters could stay hidden. She said that small, cautious scouting teams would never be able to expose the enemy's real numbers. That was why they intended to push forward with full force and force the enemy to reveal itself. By provoking a response, she explained, they could obtain reliable information without wasting precious time. She concluded by saying that this was the true advantage of forceful reconnaissance. One of the officers immediately stepped in to praise her judgment. He said the plan was bold, yet perfectly logical, exactly what one would expect from the heir of House Rodenwald, the family that guarded the kingdom's border. Amelia Rodenwald cut him off with a cold expression. She told him she had no need for praise, and instead warned them not to stop at blind obedience, but to show their own thoughts as well. She reminded them that this mission was not just an operation. It was also meant to serve as a training ground for them all. So after that sharp rebuke, Amelia Rodenwald made it clear that no one needed to hold anything back. Her words landed hard, and the entire group went still, falling into a tense silence. Then Van stepped out from the line and directly challenged the plan in front of everyone. He said that instead of forcing their way in with a full reconnaissance charge, they should send a much smaller scouting group ahead first. Van repeated his point clearly, saying that rather than relying on forceful reconnaissance, they ought to send only a handful of scouts into the area first. Leaning over the map, he explained his reasoning. The wetlands were too open, with too much clear visibility, and if the entire unit pushed forward before they even found the monsters, then the monsters would spot them long before they spotted the monsters. Amelia answered him immediately and said that he was right then. Without backing down at all, she added that this was exactly why they had chosen forceful reconnaissance in the first place. Van calmly shot back that if the enemy managed to land the first blow, there was a real chance their whole unit could be destroyed before it had time to recover. At that, Amelia's eyes narrowed sharply. With her pride plainly stirred, she asked if he truly believed she would be outmatched by nothing more than a group of monsters. Van did not flinch. In an even voice he said that since he was responsible for the lives of the men under him, it was only natural for him to assume the worst-case scenario first. Amelia went quiet for a brief moment, clearly weighing his words. Then she said that even if the possibility was extremely small, she understood why he was concerned, and she asked what alternative he proposed. Van answered without hesitation. He said his own unit should move out ahead of the others first and draw the enemy's attack. He continued by saying that if the main force advanced only after that first attack had been confirmed, then the danger of everyone being caught completely off guard would be much lower. Amelia looked straight at him and said she would at least praise him for having the nerve to speak his mind. She added that this was the kind of attitude expected from someone training to become an officer. For a single brief instant, Van found himself wondering if she might actually agree to the proposal after all. But then her tone turned cold. She said that as a tactic, his idea was simply too cowardly, and she explained that with a method like that, the scouting would not even be finished before the Legion's main force arrived. When Van tried to object, Amelia pushed on without letting him cut in. She warned that if their presence was detected too early, all they would do was hand the enemy extra time to prepare. She said that kind of hesitation would not save them. It could just as easily choke the operation to death instead. Then, slicing one hand through the air like a blade, she declared that the most effective tactic was to strike before the enemy had finished preparing at all. Van knew she was right. At least if this were an ordinary situation, and everything were unfolding under normal conditions. Problem was, he already knew this operation was going to fail. So he tried once more, pointing out that they were only a temporary training unit, and that their ability to react to unknown dangers was limited from the start. This time Amelia cut him off and demanded real evidence. She asked exactly what threat he was claiming to see, whether he meant enemy numbers, a trap in the terrain, or something else entirely, and she ordered him to prove it. Van clenched his teeth. Inside, he admitted to himself that there was very little he actually knew for certain. In his previous life, he had only been a Galda mercenary, and back then he had been stationed far away on the western border, nowhere near this place. What he did remember was that the information surrounding the monsters that appeared in the Lament wetlands had been sealed away by the Kingdom Army and erased from the official records afterward. He suspected that Heinz Faranya probably knew something about it. But in that life, it had never been an issue that involved Van personally. Amelia then said that worries without proof were nothing but cowardice, and that speaking that way would only drag down the soldiers' morale for no reason at all. When Van tried to speak again, she shut him down sharply and ordered him to stop. She said that she allowed suggestions, but any further objections, she warned, would be treated as outright disobedience. Then she ordered Van Kruger to step back. Van lowered his head and said nothing more. With that, Amelia brought the debate to an end, and declared that the forceful reconnaissance would begin at once. She announced that she would personally lead the company from the front and ordered every unit to prepare for immediate deployment. Around the map, the soldiers answered together in one voice, making it clear they understood the order. After shutting Van down, Amelia turned to him and said that if he wanted such an overly cautious battle, then his unit would be assigned to the rear. She added coldly that it was the safest position they could have. Van clicked his tongue inwardly and realized just how bad this had become. He reminded himself that even for Magic Academy students, disobedience could be punished harshly, with the best outcome being expulsion and the worst being imprisonment. Around him, the others kept their thoughts to themselves, but the mood was easy to read. Some quietly felt that Agalda would naturally be useful in scouting, and they even understood the point Van had been trying to make. Still, they also thought he had spoken far too boldly. Now that he was stuck in the rear, likely to return empty-handed, he would gain no merit at all. Van lowered his eyes and forced himself to think things through. He told himself there still had to be something he could do. Then a thought came to him. Being placed in the rear might actually give him one opportunity that only someone in that position could use. Not long after that, the unit finally moved into the wetlands. The very front, Amelia rode with her spear lowered, leading the cavalry as they cut their way through the tall grass. Then, only a moment later, a pack of monsters burst out from ahead of them. Van recognized them at once as Noxfangs, small monsters that lived in the swamps. Their combat strength was low, but the fangs they carried were laced with magical poison. One of the soldiers shouted that there was a small monster squad up ahead and called out, asking if they should fall back. Amelia rejected that idea immediately. She said there was no reason to retreat from weak creatures like these, and that they would simply sweep them aside. A blazing magic circle flared behind her as she activated her mounted battle magic, and in the same breath, she cried out the name of the attack. Storm Spear Charge. Spear and spell came crashing down on the Noxfangs in one violent, overwhelming sweep. As she tore straight through the pack, the soldiers could only stare in amazement, and one of them shouted that this was House Rodenwald's mounted battle magic. The others immediately followed her lead. Voices rang out as they invoked Flame Arrow and shouted for everyone to follow Lady Amelia. A rain of fire arrows came down right after that and finished off the scattered beasts. The soldiers broke into excited cheers, shouting that the Magic Academy students were incredible and that this mission was going to be easy after all. Far in the rear, Van watched those distant explosions bloom across the wetlands and quietly said that it had begun. One of Van's men glanced after the enemy and asked if they really were not going to pursue, his voice tight with frustration as he said there was nothing more they could do from where they stood. Van, however, stayed completely unshaken and calmly told him not to worry about that. Instead of answering right away, Van lifted a hand and pointed toward a strange-looking plant growing nearby, then ordered the soldiers to rip it out of the ground and gather it. The men could only stare at him, blinking in confusion. One of them muttered like he could not believe what he was hearing, while another frowned and said that pathetic-looking weed would not even be good enough to use as firewood. Van gave a short reply, telling them he already knew that and would explain everything later. For now, he kept his tone low and firm, ordering them to stay quiet and collect as much of the plant as they possibly could. Even though none of them understood what he was planning, the soldiers still obeyed and moved to carry out the order. Far ahead at the front line, Amelia Rodenwald cut down another beast in one clean strike, then immediately called for the unit to push forward again without losing momentum. Her voice rang out sharply across the battlefield as she shouted for everyone to keep moving and not let the advance stall. As the cavalry kept pressing through the swamp, one of the soldiers suddenly leaned forward in the saddle, pointed into the distance, and shouted that there was something up ahead. Amelia instantly turned her head toward the direction he was indicating. Another soldier excitedly praised the man for having such sharp eyes, then eagerly asked if they should go after it. Someone else jumped in at once, full of confidence, and declared that this time he would be the one to land the first blow. The whole group rushed toward the strange purple shape rising through the haze ahead of them, but the moment they closed in, the situation turned upside down. A burst of violent violet lightning exploded from the mist, and in the next instant the soldiers jerked back in horror as a body fell straight to the ground. One of the men could only stare in a daze, then still frozen in place. He asked what in the world had just happened. Amelia's eyes snapped upward at once, her attention locking onto the source above. Out of that swirling mass of purple energy, a gigantic insect-like monster descended in front of them, its body crackling with savage electrical power as it came down through the storm. A monstrous thunderbug dropped through the curtain of violet lightning like a disaster taking shape in midair. The soldiers instinctively recoiled, faces draining of color as they shouted that they had no idea what kind of monster they were even looking at. Others, their voices shaking, stammered out that the lightning strike from just moments ago had come from that creature. Prince Heinz identified it at once as a thunderbug, and the men cried out in disbelief, saying it made no sense for a high-level insect demon like that to appear in a swamp like this. They knew exactly how terrifying that name was. The thunderbug was supposed to be a high-ranking insect demon found only in the northern mountains, and just its appearance alone was treated like a natural disaster. Normally, a monster like that would require a full national subjugation force to bring down. As the insect's body began crackling with power again, one of the soldiers noticed the buildup and shouted a warning that the next lightning strike was coming. Before the soldiers could even regain their footing or prepare themselves, another bolt came crashing down right into their midst. One man let out a scream, several others stumbled backward in panic, and Amelia watched grimly as the attack landed. Through clenched teeth, she observed that the lightning was terrifyingly powerful, so strong that even magical defenses could not completely block it. The thunderbug towered over the battlefield like a nightmare made real. And little by little, fear began spreading through the soldiers' ranks. A soldier gulped and blurted out that there was no way they could possibly defeat something like that. Another desperately called on Amelia Rodenwald to order a retreat, while someone else reported that the troops were already starting to panic. Then the blonde prince cut straight through the disorder with a commanding voice, ordering everyone to stay calm. He warned them that if they broke and ran without orders, they would only expose their backs and be struck down from behind. He immediately gave precise instructions, telling them to spread out, stay low to the ground, disrupt the Thunderbug's line of fire, and wait for whatever opening they could find to counterattack. The soldiers answered in unison that they understood, and moved to follow the order. Amelia gave a brief acknowledgement, admitting that was exactly what she would expect from the prince, and thanked him for steadying the troops. But she did not stop there. She immediately asked if he had any plan for what to do next, and the prince grimly admitted that from this distance, even he had no way to break through the Thunderbug's shell. Hearing that, Amelia quickly judged the situation for herself. If long-range fighting was the monster's strongest point, then there was only one answer left. They would have to force the battle into close quarters. With no hesitation, she declared that she would charge in alone and bring the creature down with her own hands. Her men immediately objected, warning that the lightning would kill her before she ever reached it. Amelia shot back without wavering, saying they should not underestimate her warhorse, because it could endure at least 1 or 2 strikes. Then she ordered the soldiers to make use of the opening she created, keep their formation from collapsing, and stay behind to support the prince. When the men answered that they understood, Amelia urged them to remember who they were and show the pride of the kingdom's soldiers. She tightened her grip, fixed her eyes on the thunderbug, and measured the rhythm of its attacks. Based on the interval she had just observed, she calculated that the creature seemed to need roughly 4 seconds to recharge its lightning. In her mind, the plan was simple and brutal. If she charged at full speed, the monster would only have time to fire once, and if she could survive that single strike, she would be inside its effective range. Having made up her mind, Amelia kicked forward and launched her storm spear charge in a straight burst of speed. But at that exact instant, something suddenly whipped around her horse's legs from below. Amelia looked down in shock and saw what had caught her. It was binding vines, a tribone swamp plant that trapped animals and prey in marshland and restricted their movement the moment it latched on. And those vines had wound themselves tightly around the warhorse, bringing its charge to a dead stop. Almost at the same moment, demon fang beasts burst in from the side and lunged at her. Amelia swung down at them from the saddle, striking back immediately. But the sudden snare had already broken her momentum and ruined the force of her advance. Her horse let out a shrill cry and reared violently, nearly throwing everything into chaos. Amelia cursed under her breath, fighting to keep control as she forced herself to stay calm in the middle of it. Then the thunderbug fired. A massive pillar of violet lightning came crashing down directly onto Amelia's position. Amelia cried out as the electricity tore through her body and blasted the ground around her. Even while her limbs convulsed under the strike, she still managed to grasp what was happening. The demon fang beasts were holding her in place, even at the cost of their own lives, pinning her down without the slightest concern for being caught in the thunderbug's lightning themselves. Through trembling breath and clenched teeth, Amelia realized that if that was true, then these monsters were not charging blindly at all. In a flash of horror, she understood the truth. The monsters were fighting with tactics. The soldiers could only stand there in shock as they watched Amelia collapse under that layered assault of trap, beasts, and lightning. Some of them cried out in disbelief, shouting that even Amelia Rodenwald could not withstand something like that. Others panicked and demanded to know what they were supposed to do now. For the briefest instant, even the blonde prince could only stare at the scene in stunned silence. Then, right in the middle of that confusion, a sharp voice cut through everything. Van shouted that they had to move that way, and without wasting another second, he ordered the men to run straight into the smoke. Not far from there, soldiers were already crouched over patches of smoke grass, setting the plants on fire one after another. Smoke grass was a plant that came from the demon realm and naturally took root in places like this. It absorbed magically infused metal elements from deep underground, and once it was burned, it released thick black smoke packed with heavy metal particles. That smoke did not scatter easily, even when the wind pushed against it. Instead, it clung low to the ground and spread outward, forming a dense screen of darkness that could hide an entire group. Van quickly explained that the thunderbug's lightning was devastatingly strong, but its aim got worse when the target was in motion. And more importantly, if the insect could not see them through the smoke, then it would not be able to hit them accurately. He immediately raised his voice again, ordering the wounded to be carried, then told everyone to push through the smoke screen and make for the forest behind them. The blonde prince backed Van without hesitation, and issued the command at once, ordering every soldier there to follow Van's instructions immediately. They obeyed on the spot. Some men hoisted the injured onto their backs, while others moved alongside them with weapons ready, guarding them as the whole group retreated through the black smoke. As the withdrawal got underway, the prince called out to Van and warned him that Amelia Rodenwald was still trapped back there. Van answered instantly, without even a flicker of hesitation, that he would go retrieve her himself. Then he turned the responsibility over to the blonde prince and ordered him to take charge of the soldiers' retreat. The prince accepted at once and said he understood. With the battlefield disappearing behind curtains of smoke and the surviving soldiers pulling back toward the forest, Van turned his horse around and rode back toward the Thunderbug and Amelia Rodenwald's position. The prince watched him go as the remaining troops pushed deeper into the trees, carrying the wounded with them. Deeper inside the forest, the survivors eventually regrouped in the dim, uneasy gloom, huddled around patches of firelight and heavy silence, while Van alone rode back into that storm-choked battlefield. Amelia Rodenwald, already wrapped in bandages after being brought back alive, sat near the fire. When Van returned from scouting and simply announced that he was back, the blonde prince immediately looked toward him and asked how it had gone. Van answered grimly that countless monsters were roaming through the forest and that they were now completely surrounded on all sides. At those words, the soldiers visibly paled, and several of them blurted out in shock that there was no way out anymore. Some of them desperately asked whether they could still force a path through somewhere. Van explained that if they left the forest, they would only end up exposed in the open swamp with nowhere to hide, and once that happened, the Thunderbug's lightning would wipe them out. The prince then pointed out that staying in the forest was hardly safe either. Van gave a short nod and said that once night fell, beast demons would start attacking under the cover of darkness. The prince turned his eyes toward the wounded men lying nearby and said their condition was getting worse and that they needed to reunite with the main force and find a healer as quickly as possible. After checking the injured himself, Van observed that the ones struck by the lightning were somehow still alive. Hines answered that this was only because Van had shown them the retreat route so quickly when everything fell apart. Van looked at the wounded again and said that somehow, no matter what, they had to save them. The prince agreed and said that the only way to do that now was to defeat the Thunderbug. Van agreed too, adding that the creature was clearly the one leading the monster pack, but halfway through saying it, he suddenly caught himself and wondered why he was speaking to the prince so casually. When the prince gently asked if something was wrong, Van turned his face away and warned himself not to get carried away. For a brief moment, he remembered how he once believed Heinz Ferrania was his greatest partner, the one man who could stand beside him, and that no matter how desperate things became, the two of them would always find some path forward together. Then he forced himself to remember the truth. The real Heinz was his worst enemy, the man who had taken everything from him. And just then, Amelia slowly rose to her feet. Her body was still covered in bandages, and the arrogance that usually showed on her face was completely gone. In that stripped-down, solemn state, she declared that she would defeat the Thunderbug herself. She openly admitted that this disaster had begun because of her own mistaken judgment, that she had ignored Van's warning, and that because of that choice, she had put the entire unit in danger. Then she said that as the commander, she had no excuse for any of it. After that, she lowered herself before Van and apologized to him directly. The soldiers fell completely silent at the sight, and Van could only stare at Amelia in visible surprise. Amelia then said that she would at least carry out her final duty as commander. Looking at Van, she asked to borrow Van Kruger's horse. Van narrowed his eyes and asked her what exactly she intended to do. Amelia answered plainly that she would ride alone into the encirclement and act as a decoy, while she drew the monsters to herself. Everyone else was to escape with the wounded. The soldiers immediately cried out that the idea was insane and asked if she was planning to throw her life away. Amelia replied in a calm, steady voice that this was how she intended to take responsibility. She entrusted the soldiers to the prince, then turned back toward Van. Van answered that he had no problem lending her the horse, but there was no way he was going to accept some dull plan where she rode off by herself just to die. Amelia stared at him, clearly confused by his response, and asked what he meant by that. Van then declared that every last one of them was going back alive. He said that if they were going to make that happen, then they would defeat the Thunderbug here and now, and he added that he had just come up with a plan to do it. Amelia and the soldiers were visibly shaken by that claim, and more than a few of them wondered in disbelief whether it was even possible for everyone to survive and escape from a situation like this. The prince, however, reacted differently. A clear smile appeared on his face, and he said that Van's idea sounded very interesting. Then he asked Van to explain exactly what kind of plan he had in mind. Van called everyone in closer, gathered them around, and began laying out the operation step by step. He told them the plan would begin right after sunset. He explained that just before the darkness fully settled in, the monsters would start moving into the forest under the cover of night. Amelia immediately questioned that timing, saying that attacking before sunset would seem more favorable for them. Van replied that during daylight, The monsters were still cautious enough to read their intentions too easily. Then he explained that the best moment would be immediately after sunset, because the instant the monsters began their attack was also the instant their guard would be at its weakest. Everyone around him listened in silence, focused on every word, while Amelia, still seated among them despite her injuries, told him to go on. Van gave a small nod and began explaining the first step of the plan. He said that one person would deliberately act as a decoy and release a strong burst of magical power. That would draw the monster swarm's attention and pull all of their focus in a single direction. He went on to say that if the thunderbug fired its lightning at that decoy, then the flash would expose its location and let them pinpoint exactly where it was hiding. And the moment that happened, Amelia would move during the thunderbug's 5-second recharge window and launch a surprise attack before it could fire again. Amelia listened all the way through, then immediately pointed out the weakness in Van's proposal without missing a beat. She reminded him that the path to the thunderbug was not going to be clear. Along the way, there would still be beast-type monsters and tree monsters blocking the route. And if she got tangled up and delayed by them the same way she had been before, then those precious 5 seconds would vanish in an instant before she ever reached the target. Van answered right away that she was completely correct. And that was exactly why this time she would have to fight in a different way than before. He told her that the very moment the charge started, she had to unleash her strongest technique, Storm Spear Charge. She would have to blast apart the monsters blocking the way, force open the shortest route possible, and drive straight through to the thunderbug without slowing down. Amelia frowned and answered at once that Storm Spear Charge was a decisive finishing spell, one that concentrated an enormous amount of magical power into a single point. If she wasted that force on clearing lesser monsters before reaching the thunderbug, then by the time she arrived, the attack would already be weakened, and in that state it would never pierce that monster's shell. Van replied that once she got inside its range, he would buy her the time she needed to recover that lost moment. Amelia stared at him and asked how he intended to do something like that. Van answered in a calm, matter-of-fact voice that he would ride on the same horse with her. The soldiers standing nearby visibly flinched, their faces tightening in shock the moment they heard that answer. Van continued without hesitation and finished laying out the plan. While he held the line and bought her time, Amelia would gather her magic again, then kill the thunderbug with a close-range Storm Spear Charge. He ended his explanation by saying that the moment Amelia brought the thunderbug down, the rest of the unit would charge straight into the monster swarm and rescue the two of them from the isolated position they would be stuck in. The instant those words left his mouth, several soldiers exploded in protest. They shouted that the plan was insane, and one man openly demanded to know how a magicless Galda like Van was supposed to stand against the thunderbug at all. Others piled on, saying the whole idea was absurd and that it would only get Amelia Rodenwald killed. But before that panic could spread any farther, one of Van's rougher, battle-hardened soldiers stepped forward and roared at the rest to shut their mouths, calling them idiots. That veteran barked out that this was the moment to listen to their captain, then ordered the others to stop spewing nonsense and get their heads straight. Another soldier turned toward him in disbelief and asked whether he truly meant it, whether he actually believed in a plan that crazy. But the others answered before he could. They said that yes, they did believe in it because they believed in Captain Van. One of them reminded the rest that Van had already told them they would not die for nothing, and the veteran answered that if those were his captain's words, then they would stake their lives on them. Van lifted his eyes toward them, and for once the surprise on his face was impossible to hide. Watching that exchange unfold in front of her, Amelia was deeply shaken. She realized that Van had earned the loyalty of his men to a degree that was almost unbelievable. As she kept staring at him, she remembered the fierce way he had once thrown himself into a one-on-one fight against a powerful enemy, and that memory rose vividly in her mind. And in that moment she found herself thinking that in a situation like this man might actually be capable of doing something that should have been impossible. Amelia slowly closed her eyes, steadied her breathing, and when she opened them again, she said that she understood. Then she told Van, plainly and without hesitation, that she would entrust her back to him. Van accepted that with a small, calm smile. But Amelia immediately continued and said there was still one more problem. Someone still had to act as the decoy and deliberately take the thunderbug's lightning. She warned them that if the person assigned to that role had weak magical protection, then a single direct hit would leave them unable to fight, and in the worst case they could die on the spot. When she asked whether anyone there would volunteer for that role, the entire group fell into a heavy, uneasy silence. Then the blonde prince broke that silence. He glanced around once, said that he understood the situation, and calmly declared that he would take that role himself. The soldiers were horrified. They cried out that His Highness could not do such a thing, begged him to reconsider, and said the danger was far too great. But the prince answered with perfect composure that royalty were meant to stand at the very front of the people and fight in the most dangerous places. Then he asked them who else was supposed to do it if he would not. Amelia immediately objected. She said that this entire crisis had begun because of her failure as commander, and because of that, she could not allow His Highness to shoulder that responsibility in her place. The blonde prince turned to Amelia and told her that her responsibility now was to strike down the thunderbug with her spear. He added that supporting that blow was his duty as platoon leader, then calmly asked whether he was wrong about that. Amelia looked up at him with hesitation in her eyes, while the prince met her gaze without the slightest sign of doubt. Van then asked him directly if he was truly certain about going through with this. Without wavering for even a second, Heinz Ferrania answered that he would draw as much of the enemy's attention to himself as possible. He called Van by name and ordered him to bring down the thunderbug together with Amelia Rodenwald. Van answered that he had every intention of doing exactly that even without being told. Then he turned to the others and explained that once the thunderbug was defeated, they would no longer have to fear attacks raining down on them from behind. After that, with whatever strength they still had left, they would smash through the remaining monsters in the swamp and force their way out alive. Then Van added one final condition to the operation. He declared that their objective was for every single one of them to return alive, and that under no circumstances would they leave anyone behind. His voice rose with absolute force as he repeated that no one, absolutely no one, would be abandoned. At those words, the soldiers around him fell completely silent. Amelia watched their expressions shift before her eyes and realized that hope had returned to them. And even she, despite everything, felt that this man might truly be able to turn the impossible into reality. Once that resolve had settled over the group, Amelia gathered magic around herself, straightened up, and called for everyone's attention. She announced that this would be their final operation. Then, with a commander's voice, she ordered them to throw everything they had into it and fulfill their duty as soldiers of the kingdom. As the dusk grew deeper and the swamp darkened by the minute, the prince quietly stepped away from the others and looked out over the encroaching night. Under his breath, he remarked that he could not very well let Van be the only one showing off and said that he supposed it was time for him to put in some effort too. Then he released his power. At once, vast magic circles and streams of luminous energy spread out around him, and the soldiers could only stare in awe at the overwhelming amount of magic pouring from his body. As that power flared across the battlefield, the soldiers noticed movement all throughout the swamp. Monsters from every direction were beginning to rush toward the prince. The prince stood there alone, inside that enormous glowing field, while high above the thunderbug fixed its gaze on him and began gathering violent energy for the strike to come. As the darkness thickened around them, more and more shapes began to take form inside it. Beasts, winged creatures, and other monstrous silhouettes crowded together in the black, steadily closing the distance as the entire mass crept nearer. One of the soldiers suddenly shouted that it was coming, his voice cutting sharply through the chaos and warning everyone that the threat had finally arrived. At the same time, others raised their voices and yelled for everyone to protect the prince, making it clear that no matter what happened, their first duty was to keep him alive. Torches were immediately thrown out into the darkness ahead, and the soldiers shouted that they had to expose the enemy before it got any closer. The burning torches spun end over end through the air, then slammed down onto the path in front of them. And in an instant, that splash of firelight tore open the darkness. The moment the flames lit the area, the hidden swarm was finally revealed. Bat-like monsters, wolves, hulking beasts, and countless other creatures all came pouring out at once, filling the path in a terrifying wave, and every last one of them was rushing straight for the prince. As that flood of monsters surged toward him, some of the soldiers froze at the sight of just how many there were. Staring at the endless mass of beasts, they blurted out that the numbers were overwhelming and that there was no way they could stop all of them. Their veteran commander instantly roared back at them not to panic, snapping them out of that fear before it could spread any further. He barked out the order to hold the line until the thunderbug appeared, then warned them that if the prince fell before that moment, the entire operation would collapse right then and there. The soldiers answered with fierce battle cries, then threw themselves headfirst into the oncoming swarm without hesitation. They hacked wildly with their blades, cutting down the charging beasts as they came, all while shouting that they would never let the monsters break through. Even with fear written plainly across their faces, they still planted themselves between the prince and the approaching horde, bracing their bodies and refusing to give ground. Meanwhile, the prince stood alone before that wall of monsters, his expression completely steady, without even the slightest sign of wavering. Then his eyes caught a purple glow descending from above, and he immediately announced that it was there. Without wasting a single moment, he unleashed his defensive magic with everything he had. A massive barrier flared to life around him, just as the thunderbug dropped a gigantic bolt of lightning straight onto his position. The impact hurled the prince backward inside that crackling barrier, and a painful groan escaped him as the force slammed through his body. But even so, he endured it. Far in the distance, Van caught sight of that flash and immediately shouted that they had found its location. Amelia answered at once that they had. Just as they were preparing to move, the prince called out for Van to go, then added that he would give them a little extra support before they did. He lifted one hand and cast holy light, telling it to illuminate their way forward. A brilliant pillar of light burst across the battlefield, cutting through the darkness and clearly revealing a straight path ahead. Amelia's eyes widened the moment she saw it, and she immediately realized that the light had come from the prince. She said she could see the route now, then firmly declared that they would push straight through along the shortest path. With Van seated behind her on the horse, Amelia lowered her spear and drove forward in a full charge. As they rushed ahead, Van glanced back at the prince's glowing figure and found himself wondering why that kind of devotion, that way of fighting while wearing yourself down for others, felt so strangely familiar to him. For a split second, he thought it was exactly like Heinz in the past. But he immediately shoved the thought aside, warning himself not to get caught up in anything unnecessary and to keep his attention fixed only on what lay ahead. With only 4 seconds left before the next lightning strike, Amelia drove her horse straight through the monsters in front of them. She shouted the name of her technique and unleashed Storm Spear Charge directly into the path ahead. The resulting torrent of force blasted wolves aside and ripped open a lane straight through the packed mass of monsters. The moment Amelia spotted the Thunderbug in the distance, she judged that from this position, she could still reach it before the next strike came down. With 3 seconds remaining, the ground ahead suddenly burst upward without warning. Amelia cried out in shock as a mud golem rose up directly in front of them, blocking their charge. The mud golem was a pseudo-life form, created around a crystallized mass of underground magic that served as its core. Its muddy body itself was fragile, but because it carried such tremendous viscosity and weight, it could absorb physical blows and disperse their force, instead of taking the impact head-on. Amelia understood the danger instantly. She realized this was bad, that the swamp had already been slowing her down, and that if this continued, the power behind her charge would be completely killed. For a brief moment, she wondered if she should try to go around it instead. Van immediately shouted at her not to slow down. And before Amelia even had time to react to that order, Van launched himself off the horse. Using all the momentum from Storm Spear Charge, he shot forward like a cannonball loosed from a ballista, flying straight at the mud golem. As he rushed toward it, Van analyzed the structure in an instant and realized that a mud golem's core formed lower than the center of gravity in its body. He knew that with only his own raw strength, reaching that point would have been difficult. But with this much added speed behind him, it was possible. Then, letting out a fierce cry, Van struck. He drove straight into the mud golem's body and smashed forward toward the hidden core buried inside it. With only 1 second left before the next discharge, Van blasted straight through the mud golem and blew its entire body apart in a single devastating strike. Amelia could only stare in disbelief as she realized he had sent the golem flying with one blow. As Van dropped out of the shattered mass, he thought to himself that if enough speed was added to a direct straight-line strike, then even an obstacle like that could be broken through. He fell back down toward Amelia's horse and complained that he had assumed she was going to catch him. And right as he said it, the countdown hit 0. The Thunderbug rose up into the air wrapped in purple lightning, and the instant Amelia saw it, she sensed that another attack was about to come. Van answered calmly that he knew. Then he declared that from that point on, it was his turn, and with that, he kicked off from the horse and shot straight toward the insect. The creature's killing intent was still locked on Amelia, but Van hurled himself directly into its line of attack and shouted that he would not let it fire at her. Amelia cried out Van's name in shock as he closed the distance. Van's aim had never been to stop that attack head-on in the first place. What he used instead was a beast-slaying technique, one that gathered the strength of the largest muscles in his lower body and condensed all of it into a single perfectly straight kick. But even as he moved, Van understood the limit of what that attack could do. He realized right away that a kick alone would never be enough to smash through the Thunderbug's hardened shell. In that same moment, the insect shifted its focus and recognized Van as the more urgent target, deciding to eliminate him first. Its attacks came whipping at him with terrifying speed. But even while dodging, Van kept his mind clear and judged that fast as they were, they still had not reached the level of the ring technique he had once faced from Karina. Using that comparison as his guide, he twisted his body through the air, slipped past the insect's striking limbs by the narrowest margin, and forced his way deeper into its range. With a roar, Van struck back at point-blank range, hammering the insect in midair with a rapid flurry of blows. The Thunderbug was knocked backward by the barrage, but Van was thrown away as well, sent crashing hard to the ground. Even so, the insect recovered almost immediately, and its body was still completely intact. The moment Van saw that, he understood that his attacks were not landing as cleanly as he had hoped. But instead of panicking, he steadied himself and decided that this was still acceptable if he could not destroy it in one go, then he would make sure it never had the chance to recharge in peace. The insect's limbs stabbed and swept across the ground over and over, while Van kept slipping between them, rolling, ducking, and cutting through the grass as Amelia watched everything from horseback. Watching him fight like that, Amelia finally understood that this was what a battle looked like for someone who had no magic to rely on. That sight stirred loose an old memory buried deep inside her. In her mind, her father appeared before her and told her that the great magic possessed by nobles existed for one purpose: to protect those who had none. He told her that if she truly understood the weight of what she carried, Then even if her arm were to break, she must never let go of her spear. He declared that this was the pride of Rodenwald, and he commanded her to rise, Amelia. Back in the present, Amelia tightened her grip around her spear and called out to her father in her heart, asking him to lend her strength one more time. She reflected that all her life, she had never once doubted those teachings, and yet now, right in front of her eyes, Van, the very person who by her old standards should have counted among the powerless, was the one standing there and protecting her. That realization hit her like a blow. For the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong from the very beginning. She began to question whether the pride she had treasured all this time had really been nothing more than arrogant pride, the kind that judged a person's worth only by how much magic they possessed. Her expression hardened. In that instant, she understood that Prince Heinz and Van had given her one last chance, and she swore to herself that with this strike, she would pierce the insect without fail. As that resolve settled firmly inside her chest, Amelia gathered all her power and drove forward once again. At the very same time, Van forced the insect into yet another exchange. He slammed down with every bit of strength he had, then lifted his eyes and wondered if that blow had finally done it. Believing he had at last opened a path through, he immediately moved to follow up without hesitation. Then, in that exact moment, something changed. Van's expression shifted, and before he could complete the follow-up attack, the thunderbug's tail snapped at him like a whip. Amelia cried out as blood burst from Van's body and he was flung backward with a sharp gasp of pain. Segments in the insect's tail moved independently, creating a whip-like motion whose tip speed surpassed even Van's reflexes, because he had already grown used to its close-range attacks from the legs instead. Amelia clenched her teeth and cursed under her breath. But at that same moment, she also realized that her magic charge had finally finished. She tried to rush in immediately, thinking she would save Van at once. But the insect moved before she could. It seized Van in its grasp and pulled him into position directly in front of its own body. Amelia froze where she was, staring in disbelief as she instantly understood what had just happened. She thought that it was impossible. First, the creature had acted in coordination with the other monsters. Then it had used a surprise attack with its tail after luring Van into growing accustomed to close combat. And now it was using a human shield. Horror washed over her as she realized that this monster was very clearly making tactical decisions. She admitted to herself that she had never heard of anything like this before. And as Amelia held her spear poised and ready, another realization struck her just as hard. If the next lightning strike was fired, she had no way to withstand it. But if she released her spear like this, Van would be caught in the attack as well. Her grip began to tremble. Then Van spoke, and he told her that it was fine. Amelia stared at him in shock as Van said that if she fired right now, they would win with that single blow. Amelia immediately tried to protest, telling him that if she did that, he would die too. Van cut her off at once. He shouted that she must not hesitate, that there was no time left, and that she had to fulfill her duty as a commander. Amelia locked eyes with him, and in that instant she understood that what she was seeing in his eyes was not reckless resolve. What Amelia saw in his eyes wasn't hesitation anymore. It was a rock-solid certainty. The kind of absolute confidence that made it feel like victory was already within reach, and she knew better than anyone that Van had already broken past her common sense again and again. The moment that thought settled in, Amelia finally made her decision. If that was the case, then this time, she would stop doubting and place her faith in him for real. She shouted that she was going in, and at once, magic circles burst to life around her, in a furious whirl. Then she unleashed another storm spear charge, the air around her roaring as the spell surged into motion. Without holding anything back, Amelia hurled herself straight at the thunderbug, pouring all of her strength into that single forward thrust. As her charge came screaming toward it, the thunderbug let out a sharp, piercing shriek. Van, still dangerously close to the monster, and well within its reach, suddenly raised his voice and shouted that this was the moment. That exact same instant, Van grabbed hold of the insect's tail and twisted his whole body into the motion. This was his combined trajectory technique. Turn. The thunderbug's tail was built from multiple joints, each segment moving independently with flexible range, but Van forced a rotational load onto the very tip that exceeded what that structure could handle. The first joint hit its limit almost immediately, its range of motion completely saturated. What followed was a phenomenon known as gimbal lock. Once several rotating axes overlapped onto the same plane, the tail lost its freedom of movement, and any precise control over it became impossible. Using nothing but raw physical force, Van created a structural flaw inside the creature's own body. The thunderbug cried out in strain as its entire body jerked out of alignment. Still hanging onto the tail with everything he had, Van shouted at Amelia to drive her spear straight through it. Amelia yelled back in answer, and with every ounce of power she had left, thrust her spear into the opening Van had created. Her charge smashed into the thunderbug head-on, and in the next heartbeat, a savage burst of magic and lightning erupted, swallowing the battlefield in a blinding blast. When the explosion finally died down, the swamp had been carved open, and the land around them was left ripped apart by the sheer force of the impact. Amelia dropped to the ground, gasping for breath. But the very next second she jerked her head up and began looking around in alarm. Desperation flooded her voice as she called out for him, shouting Van Kruger's full name while frantically searching through the wreckage. Then her eyes shot wide open when she finally spotted him. Van was still on his feet in the middle of the devastation, one hand clamped over the bloody wound in his chest. Not far from him, a piece of the thunderbug's severed tail lay on the ground, still twitching as faint purple sparks crackled and faded from it. Amelia ran straight to him crying that he had to stay with her, and that he was not allowed to die, and she caught him just as his strength finally gave out, and he collapsed. Van let out a weak, breathless laugh and told her she had made it look spectacular. Then he admitted, almost casually, that for a moment there, he had genuinely thought he was going to die. Still visibly shaken, Amelia demanded to know what had actually happened. She told him there was no way her spear should have carried enough force to produce an explosion on that scale. Van turned his gaze toward the shattered remains of the thunderbug and began explaining. From the very start, while he had been striking it over and over, he had not just been attacking blindly, he had been probing for a weakness. He said he had been using Crushing Strike with the power deliberately lowered while increasing the rotational force behind it, so that the impacts would send vibrations through the shell, letting him read how those vibrations bounced back. From that, he had located one spot beneath the twin wing veins on its back, an area where the vibrations were being absorbed in an unnatural way. That was how he concluded it had to be where the insect's monocore was located. And once Amelia made her charge, he guided the tip of her spear toward that exact point. The moment her spear pierced the core, the lightning magic stored inside the creature ran wild, and that loss of control was what triggered the enormous detonation. Amelia could only stare at him in stunned disbelief as she asked if he had really worked all of that out in the middle of a single exchange of blows. Van answered that, even so, it had still been a gamble. The second he said that, Amelia snapped at him on instinct, called him an idiot outright, and scolded him for only telling her it had been a gamble after everything was already over. She complained that he had practically shortened her lifespan, and Van shot back that he had not exactly had the time to explain any more than that in the moment. Then, with a faint smile on his face, he quietly added that besides, he had trusted that she would pull it off. That answer stopped Amelia cold, leaving her speechless for a brief moment. Then all she could do was smile in helpless disbelief and mutter that he was saying that again. In the end, she admitted it herself. Van really was something else. A moment later, Van grimaced, pressed down on his wound again, and reminded her that this was no time for them to be resting. Amelia immediately agreed and pointed out the obvious. They were still trapped in the middle of a monster horde, her magic power was spent, and Van was already badly wounded. Because of that, she said they needed to regroup with Prince Heinz and the others as fast as possible. She proposed that they swing around to the west, but Van rejected the idea right away. Looking down at the broken corpse of the thunderbug, Van said there was something deeply wrong here. He pointed out that thunderbugs were only supposed to exist in the north, so there should have been no reason at all for one to appear in that swamp. And even if it had somehow wandered there by pure accident, the way it had coordinated with the other monsters had been far too deliberate and organized to dismiss. As he inspected the corpse more carefully, Van found a crimson crystal embedded inside it. The moment he saw it, he fixed his eyes on it and said there was no doubt anymore. It was a magic crystal. Magic crystals were formed when natural magical energy slowly gathered and crystallized over many long years. Even one of them could drastically amplify magical tools and secret techniques, which was exactly why a single crystal was worth more than the same weight in gold. Van said he had never once heard of a magic crystal naturally forming inside a monster's body. To him, that meant only one thing. Someone had deliberately embedded that crystal into the thunderbug for a reason. From that point on, his thoughts turned sharp and focused. He said this was no longer something they could dismiss as a random abnormal incident. Someone had intentionally unleashed a powerful monster against the Magic Academy unit. And after tracing that logic to its end, Van declared that the real target was most likely Heinz Ferrania. Amelia called out to him and reminded him that their escape route had already been decided. She explained that while the prince and the others drew the enemy's attention and created a distraction, the two of them would have to force their way through the encirclement somehow and reunite with the rest of the group. Van agreed at once and told her they needed to move quickly. In his mind, he knew the report about all this could come later, because right now, staying alive had to come before everything else, before either of them could take even a step. Another voice drifted up from the darkness. A hooded figure emerged from the swamp, wrapped in a wavering purple aura, and with cold amusement, the stranger remarked that it was surprising a pair of mere students had managed to bring down the figure's beloved magic thunderbug. Van's eyes instantly narrowed and locked onto the emblem displayed on the person's chest, and the moment he saw it, he recognized that symbol. Amelia stepped forward and exclaimed that the figure was one of the surviving remnants of the Purification sect. The hooded figure answered at once, sounding offended, and said that calling them remnants was insulting. The stranger went on to say that the kingdom had merely caught the tail of a lizard, yet foolishly believed it had already crushed the head. Then, with open pride, the figure declared that they were the true central faction, the ones who stood as guardians of the great pureblood. At that moment, Van felt something that sent a chill through him. something even colder and more dreadful than magic itself. It was a warning that lay beyond reason and beyond magical sensing, the kind of instinctive alarm a living being feels when standing right in front of genuine death. Some people called that sensation the smell of death. Van thought back to his previous life and realized that the only times he had ever sensed something like this were when he faced demons or monsters on the same level as them. Then he fixed his gaze on the hooded figure once more, and what he realized made his blood run even colder. The presence coming from this person felt worse than even that.